Imagine spending your entire life searching for something, only to find it changes you completely. Picture the moment when your hands touch an object that's been hidden for thousands of years, and suddenly, everything you thought you knew about the past crumbles away. These aren't tales of adventure movies or treasure hunters. These are real archaeologists who started as ordinary people with curious minds. A lawyer's daughter who spotted paintings on a cave ceiling. A businessman who became obsessed with proving Homer's stories were real. A graduate student whose fossil discovery rewrote human evolution. A woman who broke every rule about how archaeology should be done. Some became legends overnight. Others faced ridicule and rejection. Many sacrificed everything, their health, their families, their reputations, for the chance to uncover one more secret from the past. Some died before the world understood what they had found. Hiram Bingham III and Machu Picchu, 1911. In November 1875, a child was born in Honolulu who would one day stand atop a mist-covered mountain ridge in Peru and gaze upon stone walls that had been hidden from the world for centuries. But that moment of triumph was still decades away, and the man who had become famous for discovering Machu Picchu was then just Harry Bingham, a boy caught between two worlds. Hiram Bingham III grew up in the shadow of his grandfather's legacy. Hiram Bingham I had been one of the first Christian missionaries to reach the Hawaiian Islands, arriving in 1820 to convert the native population. The Bingham name carried weight in missionary circles, but it also carried expectations. Young Harry was supposed to follow the family tradition, to dedicate his life to spreading Christianity in foreign lands. His father, Hiram Bingham II, had continued the missionary work, and the assumption was that Harry would do the same. But Harry Bingham had different dreams. While his family expected him to become a missionary to China, he found himself drawn to history and languages. He was a restless student, academically gifted but searching for something his missionary upbringing couldn't provide. At Phillips Academy and later at Yale, he showed promise as a scholar, but there was an underlying tension. The dutiful son was slowly becoming his own man. In 1898, Harry graduated from Yale and seemed destined for a conventional academic career. But then came a turn of fortune that would change everything. He met Alfreda Mitchell, granddaughter of Charles Tiffany, founder of the famous jewellery empire. When they married in 1900, Harry Bingham suddenly found himself connected to one of America's wealthiest families. The struggling academic now had access to resources that most professors could only dream of. More importantly, he had the financial freedom to pursue adventures that his academic salary would never have allowed. By 1906, Bingham had earned his doctorate from Harvard and was teaching history at Yale. On paper, his life looked successful. He was a respected professor at a prestigious university, married to a wealthy wife with a growing family. But inside, something was stirring. South America called to him. He had become fascinated with the history of Spanish colonial rule, particularly in Peru. His colleagues saw him as a competent but unremarkable historian. What they didn't see was a man growing restless within the confines of academic life. His first taste of real adventure came in 1908 when he traced the route of Simon Bolivar across Venezuela and Colombia. It was supposed to be a scholarly expedition, but something happened to Bingham in those South American mountains. The classroom felt smaller when he returned. The comfortable routines of Yale seemed insufficient. He had glimpsed something larger than academic success, something that connected him to the great explorers and adventurers he'd only read about in books. By 1911, Bingham was actively seeking a return to South America. Yale gave him leave to search for Inca ruins, specifically the lost city of Vitcos, the last capital of the Inca resistance against Spanish rule. At 35, he was no longer just Professor Bingham. He was becoming an explorer, though he didn't fully understand what that transformation would cost him. The expedition that would change his life forever began in Cuzco in July 1911. Bingham hired local guides and set out into the rugged terrain of the Urubamba Valley. What he didn't realize was that he was about to become entirely dependent on knowledge that the local people had possessed for generations. The discovery that would make him famous was really a meeting between Western ambition and indigenous wisdom. On July 23rd, Bingham met a farmer named Melchor Arteaga near the Urubamba River. Through an interpreter, Bingham asked about ruins in the area. Arteaga mentioned some on a mountain called Huayna Picchu. For 50 cents, he agreed to guide the American professor up the steep mountain paths. What Bingham didn't know was that Arteaga had been farming on those terraces for years. The ruins weren't lost to everyone, just to the outside world. The climb up to what the locals called Machu Picchu was exhausting. Bingham, an academic more comfortable in libraries than on mountain trails, struggled with the altitude and the steep terrain. When they reached the ancient terraces, Arteaga handed him off to two other local men, Toribio Richarte and Anacleto Alvarez, who had been living among the ruins with their families. These men knew every stone wall, every hidden chamber. They had been the true guardians of Machu Picchu. When Bingham first saw the perfectly preserved stone walls emerging from the jungle, he understood immediately that this was something extraordinary. But in that moment of awe, he also began a transformation that would define the rest of his life. The Yale professor was disappearing. In his place was emerging something new, an explorer celebrity who would spend decades trying to live up to a single moment of fame. Bingham returned to Machu Picchu 3 more times, between 1912 and 1915, leading increasingly elaborate expeditions funded by Yale and the National Geographic Society. Each return trip reinforced his new identity. He was no longer just an academic studying history, he was making history. The photographs from these expeditions, distributed by National Geographic, made Bingham's name famous around the world, but fame came with a price that the former professor hadn't anticipated. Back at Yale, his colleagues began to treat him differently. Some were envious of his celebrity status. Others questioned whether his work was serious scholarship or just publicity-seeking adventure. Bingham found himself caught between two worlds, the academic community that had shaped his early career and the public that now saw him as a romantic figure, a real-life treasure hunter. The tension was uncomfortable, but the fame was intoxicating. The discovery at Machu Picchu opened doors that had been closed to a simple history professor. Bingham was invited to speak at prestigious venues. Publishers wanted his books. Hollywood would eventually want his story. But with each public appearance, he moved further away from the scholarly world where he had planned to spend his career. The man who had once worried about tenure and faculty meetings was becoming a brand. World War I interrupted his archaeological work, but it also provided a new stage for his transformed identity. Bingham enlisted in the aviation section of the Army Signal Corps, drawn by the same spirit of adventure that had taken him to Peru. He learned to fly and eventually commanded the largest aviation school in France. The boy who had been expected to become a missionary was now a military aviator, applying the same courage that had carried him up the mountain to Machu Picchu. When he returned from the war, Bingham discovered that his fame had opened an entirely new path: politics. In 1922, he was elected Lieutenant Governor of Connecticut. 2 years later, he won a seat in the United States Senate. The transformation was complete. The academic who had stumbled upon Machu Picchu had become Senator Bingham, a man whose political career was built on the foundation of his archaeological celebrity. But success in politics couldn't fill the void that had been growing inside him since 1911. The Senate was just another classroom, and Bingham had tasted something more exciting than legislative debates. He had experienced the thrill of discovery, the rush of standing where no outsider had stood for centuries. Political compromise couldn't match the pure moment of revelation he'd felt on that Peruvian mountainside. His political career was ultimately disappointing. He served in the Senate until 1933, but never achieved the kind of influence that his fame had promised. He was censured by his colleagues for allowing a lobbyist to help write tariff legislation. The same publicity-seeking instincts that had served him well as an explorer worked against him in the more subtle world of politics. The man who had made his reputation by bringing ancient secrets to light found himself struggling with the shadows and compromises of modern political life. In his later years, Bingham often returned to Peru, but he never again experienced the transformative moment of discovery that had changed his life. He wrote books about his adventures, gave lectures about Machu Picchu, and served in various government positions during World War II. But nothing quite captured the intensity of that July morning in 1911 when he'd climbed out of his narrow academic world and into something larger. The discovery of Machu Picchu had promised to make Bingham into something he'd never planned to become, and in many ways, it succeeded. The missionary's grandson had become an explorer. The Yale professor had become a celebrity. The academic had become a politician. But each transformation had taken him further from the careful, scholarly life he had originally planned, and perhaps further from the man he had originally been. When Hiram Bingham III died in 1956, his obituaries focused on his role as the discoverer of Machu Picchu. His academic work was barely mentioned. His political career was a footnote. The single moment that had transformed him from professor to explorer had also defined how the world would remember him forever. Heinrich Schliemann and Troy, 1870s. In the summer of 1868, a middle-aged German businessman stood on a dusty hillside in northwestern Turkey, holding a worn copy of Homer's Iliad in his hands. The academic world had long dismissed the ancient poet's tales as mere fantasy, beautiful literature with no connection to historical reality. But Heinrich Schliemann was not part of the academic world. He was a merchant who had made his fortune in gold and indigo, and he was about to challenge everything that classical scholars believed about the ancient past. For centuries, the educated classes of Europe had treated Homer's epic poems as mythology. The Trojan War, the siege that lasted 10 years, the wooden horse, the burning city, these were stories, not history. University professors taught Greek literature as art, not archaeology. The idea that someone could actually find the physical remains of Troy seemed absurd to serious scholars. They had spent generations analysing the language, the poetry, the cultural significance of the Iliad and Odyssey. But digging in the dirt for actual evidence? That was beneath academic consideration. Schliemann had come to archaeology through an unusual path. Born in 1822 in a small German village, he had grown up poor, the son of a pastor who lost his position due to scandal. At 14, Heinrich was working as a grocer's apprentice. But even then, he was different from other boys his age. He devoured books, especially stories of ancient heroes and lost civilizations. While his friends played games, Heinrich dreamed of finding the palaces where kings had lived and warriors had fought. His transformation from poor village boy to wealthy international businessman was almost as dramatic as any archaeological discovery. He learned languages with remarkable speed, eventually mastering over a dozen including Russian, Arabic, and ancient Greek. He worked his way up through trading companies, first in Amsterdam, then in St. Petersburg. When the California gold rush began in 1849, Schliemann was there, not panning for gold but selling supplies to miners at enormous profit. He understood that the real money was in serving the dreamers, not in sharing their dreams. By his 40s, Schliemann had accumulated a fortune that gave him complete freedom to pursue any interest. While other wealthy men collected art or built mansions, Heinrich Schliemann decided to prove that Homer had been writing about real places and real events. The academic establishment laughed at him. What could a businessman know about classical literature or ancient history? But Schliemann had something the academics lacked: money, determination, and a willingness to get his hands dirty. His first challenge was to locate Troy itself. Most scholars who bothered to consider the question at all placed the legendary city at various sites around the eastern Mediterranean. Some thought it had never existed. Others believed it was a composite of multiple ancient settlements. But Schliemann met Frank Calvert, a British diplomat and amateur archaeologist who had been studying the landscape of northwestern Turkey for years. Calvert had identified a promising site called Hisarlik, a large mound overlooking the Dardanelles. He had even begun small-scale excavations, but lacked the resources for a major dig. When Schliemann arrived at Hisarlik in 1870, he brought resources that professional archaeologists could only dream of. He hired dozens of workers and began excavating on a scale never before attempted. But he also brought methods that would make modern archaeologists cringe in horror. Schliemann attacked the ancient mound like a mining operation. He dug massive trenches straight down through the layers of accumulated history, destroying priceless evidence in his haste to reach what he believed was Homer's Troy. His workers hauled away entire civilizations by the cartload. Pottery fragments that could have told stories about daily life in ancient times were discarded as worthless debris. Building foundations that represented centuries of architectural development were knocked down to clear the way for deeper digging. Schliemann was looking for treasure and dramatic discoveries, not the careful documentation of cultural change over time. Professional excavation techniques, the slow, methodical recording of each artifact in its exact location, were still decades in the future. Yet for all his destructive haste, Schliemann was uncovering something extraordinary. Layer by layer, his excavations revealed the remains of multiple ancient cities, each built on the ruins of its predecessor. He found defensive walls, residential quarters, and clear evidence of violent destruction by fire. Most dramatically, he found gold. In 1873, Schliemann announced the discovery of what he called Priam's treasure, a spectacular hoard of gold jewellery, silver vessels, and bronze weapons that he claimed belonged to the legendary Trojan king. The announcement sent shockwaves through the academic world. Classical scholars who had dismissed Schliemann as an amateur treasure hunter suddenly found themselves confronting physical evidence for the historical reality of ancient Troy. The gold artifacts were undeniably real and undeniably ancient. The defensive walls, the evidence of siege and destruction, the multiple layers of settlement, all of this matched Homer's descriptions in ways that could not be easily dismissed. But Schliemann's methods remained controversial. He had smuggled Priam's treasure out of Turkey illegally, violating the terms of his excavation permit. Modern analysis would later show that the treasure actually dated to a period much earlier than the legendary Trojan War. But Schliemann's eagerness to confirm Homer's accounts led him to make dramatic claims that went far beyond what the evidence actually supported. More problematically, his excavation techniques were destroying the very evidence needed to understand what he was finding. Later archaeologists would discover that Schliemann's Great Trench had cut straight through the probable remains of Homeric Troy, obliterating much of the city he was trying to find. His impatience to reach the bottom of the mound meant that he was literally digging through the answers to his questions. Yet the impact of his work went far beyond the specific discoveries at Troy. Schliemann was proving that archaeology could reveal the historical foundations beneath legendary literature. Other sites mentioned in Homer's epics, Mycenae, Tiryns, or Orchomenos, suddenly became targets for excavation rather than just subjects for literary analysis. A new field of study was emerging: prehistoric archaeology, the investigation of civilizations that existed before written historical records. The academic world struggled to know how to respond to Schliemann. His methods were amateur and often destructive. His interpretations were frequently wrong. His claims were sometimes exaggerated beyond what the evidence warranted. But he was also opening up entirely new areas of research and forcing scholars to reconsider fundamental assumptions about the relationship between literature and history. Universities began to take field archaeology seriously for the first time. Schliemann's discoveries at Troy and later at Mycenae demonstrated that systematic excavation could reveal civilizations that had been completely unknown to historical scholarship. The Bronze Age Aegean, previously just a gap in human knowledge, suddenly became a field of active research. Classical studies would never again be limited to analysing texts. Now it would require understanding material culture as well. Schliemann's influence extended beyond archaeology to the broader public understanding of the ancient world. His popular writings and dramatic discoveries captured imaginations in ways that academic scholarship never could. Museums competed to display artifacts from his excavations. Newspapers reported his finds as front-page news. For the first time, archaeology became a subject of mass popular interest, not just scholarly debate. The techniques he pioneered, large-scale excavation, photography of discoveries, detailed publication of results, became standard practice in archaeological research. Later archaeologists would develop more careful methods of recording and preservation, but they were building on foundations that Schliemann had established. The idea that prehistoric civilizations could be recovered through systematic digging was his contribution to human knowledge. Even his mistakes proved educational. The destruction caused by his crude excavation methods taught later archaeologists the importance of careful stratigraphic recording. His tendency to overinterpret discoveries led to more rigorous standards of evidence in archaeological publication. His romantic nationalism, the desire to confirm literary traditions, gave way to more objective approaches to prehistoric research. By the 1880s, Heinrich Schliemann had transformed from a successful businessman into the father of prehistoric archaeology. Universities that had once dismissed him as an amateur now competed to award him honorary degrees. Museums displayed his discoveries as treasures of human civilization. The man who had made his fortune in commerce had given the world something far more valuable: the knowledge that legendary cities could be found, that epic poems could preserve historical memories, and that systematic excavation could reveal the deep foundations of human culture. Mary Leakey and Laetoli Footprints, 1978. On a September morning in 1978, a team of researchers working in the remote Laetoli region of Tanzania made a discovery that would rewrite the story of human evolution. Among the volcanic ash deposits, preserved for 3.6 million years, lay a trail of footprints unlike anything science had ever documented. 3 early human ancestors had walked across this landscape when the ash was still wet, leaving behind the oldest direct evidence of bipedal locomotion ever found. But for the woman who led this discovery, Mary Leakey, the moment represented something far more personal than a scientific breakthrough. It was validation of a lifetime spent challenging assumptions about how archaeological research should be conducted and who should be conducting it. Mary Douglas Nichol had never been intended for academic life. Born in London in 1913, she grew up as the daughter of an artist father who painted landscapes and portraits for a living. Her childhood was unconventional by the standards of middle-class English families. Rather than attending traditional schools, Mary spent her early years travelling with her father to archaeological sites across southern France, where he documented cave paintings and Paleolithic artefacts. While other girls her age were learning proper deportment and preparing for marriage, Mary was developing an artist's eye for detail and a deep fascination with prehistoric human cultures. Her artistic training proved to be far more valuable than any formal education could have been. By the time she was in her teens, Mary had developed exceptional skills in archaeological illustration, the precise technical drawing required to document stone tools, pottery fragments, and excavation sites. This was not decorative art, but scientific documentation, requiring both artistic talent and analytical precision. Each drawing had to capture not just the appearance of an artifact, but its significance to researchers who might never see the original object. When Mary met Louis Leakey in 1933, she was working as a freelance archaeological illustrator, supporting herself through technical drawings for various excavation reports. Louis was already established as a leading figure in East African prehistory, but he recognized immediately that Mary's artistic skills could revolutionize how archaeological discoveries were documented and understood. More importantly, he saw in her a natural archaeologist whose lack of formal training was actually an advantage. She approached excavation sites without preconceived theories about what should be found there. Their professional partnership began before their personal relationship, and both elements would prove crucial to Mary's development as a researcher. Louis provided access to major excavation sites and introduced Mary to the international community of prehistorians. But Mary brought something equally valuable to their collaboration: a methodical approach to fieldwork that prioritized careful documentation over dramatic discoveries. While Louis was known for sweeping theoretical pronouncements about human evolution, Mary focused on the patient work of excavating, cataloguing, and preserving the physical evidence. By the 1940s, Mary had become an accomplished field archaeologist in her own right, but her contributions were still largely overshadowed by Lewis's growing reputation as a lecturer and theorist. The dynamic between them reflected broader patterns in academic archaeology, where women often did the detailed technical work while men received credit for the major discoveries and theoretical insights. Mary's meticulous excavation methods and careful documentation were essential to their joint research, but Louis remained the public face of their partnership. The situation began to change in 1959, when Mary made the discovery that would establish her independent reputation. While working at Olduvai Gorge, she uncovered the nearly complete skull of what Louis initially called Zinjanthropus boisei, later reclassified as Paranthropus boisei. The find made international headlines and attracted significant funding for continued research in East Africa, but more importantly for Mary's career, it demonstrated her exceptional skill at recognizing and excavating crucial fossils. She had found the skull while working alone at the site, and her careful excavation techniques ensured that it was recovered intact with full contextual information. The success at Olduvai Gorge gave Mary the credibility and resources to pursue independent research projects. In the 1970s, she began focusing on the Laetoli region, about 30 miles south of Olduvai Gorge. The site had yielded interesting fossil animals, but Mary was particularly intrigued by unusual markings in the volcanic ash deposits. Other researchers had dismissed these as random patterns created by geological processes, but Mary's trained artist's eye detected something more systematic. The breakthrough came during the 1978 field season, when Mary and her team uncovered what became known as the Laetoli footprint trails. 3 sets of footprints clearly made by early human ancestors, preserved in volcanic ash that had been deposited 3.6 million years ago. The discovery was revolutionary because it provided direct evidence that human ancestors were walking upright much earlier than previously believed. But the implications went beyond the specific scientific findings. The Laetoli footprints represented a new kind of archaeological evidence. Instead of studying bones and tools to infer how early humans had behaved, researchers could now examine actual traces of their movements through the landscape. The footprints showed stride length, walking speed, and even suggested social groupings among early human ancestors. Mary had found a window into the daily lives of people who had lived millions of years ago. More significantly for Mary's career, the discovery established her as a leading researcher independent of Lewis's reputation. The careful excavation and documentation of the footprint trails required exactly the kinds of methodical techniques that Mary had been developing throughout her career. Other archaeologists recognized that this discovery could only have been made by someone with her particular combination of artistic training, field experience, and patient attention to detail. The international attention focused on the Laetoli footprints also highlighted the personal costs that Mary's career had demanded. For decades, she'd spent months at a time in remote field camps, far from the comfortable social world that most women of her generation inhabited. The work was physically demanding, conducted in extreme heat with limited facilities and constant exposure to dust, insects, and dangerous wildlife. Many of her contemporaries had chosen more conventional paths, but Mary had committed herself to a life that required almost complete dedication to fieldwork. The isolation of archaeological sites had also meant long separations from family and friends. While Louis travelled frequently to universities and conferences, building his reputation as a public intellectual, Mary remained in East Africa, continuing the slow work of excavation and analysis. She developed close relationships with her African research assistants and local communities, but the work required a kind of solitude that few people would have found comfortable. Her commitment to field research also meant accepting a lifestyle that offered few of the normal comforts of academic careers. University professors had offices, libraries, colleagues, and regular schedules. Mary's office was a tent or temporary field station. Her library consisted of the notes and drawings she accumulated over years of excavation. Her colleagues were often graduate students and research assistants who came and went as funding allowed. The work provided intellectual satisfaction but required enormous personal sacrifice. The recognition that followed the Laetoli discovery brought Mary the professional acknowledgement she had earned through decades of careful research. Universities offered her honorary degrees, professional organisations elected her to leadership positions, publishers competed to publish her memoirs, but by then she was in her 60s and had already made the choices that defined her career. The fame came too late to change the fundamental isolation that her work had required. The footprint discovery also represented the culmination of Mary's approach to archaeological research. While many of her contemporaries focused on dramatic fossil discoveries or sweeping theories about human evolution, Mary had always been most interested in understanding how early humans had actually lived. The footprints provided exactly that kind of evidence. Direct traces of daily life preserved across millions of years. Kathleen, Kenyon and Jericho, 1950s. In the summer of 1952, a 46-year-old British archaeologist arrived at an ancient mound in Palestine, carrying something that would forever change how the world understood the past. Kathleen Kenyon didn't bring treasure maps or dramatic theories about lost civilizations. Instead, she carried graph paper, measuring tape, and an unshakable belief that the Earth itself could tell stories more accurately than any ancient text ever written. The mound was Tel es-Sultan, better known as Ancient Jericho, and it had been calling to archaeologists for decades. This wasn't virgin territory. John Garstang had already excavated here from 1930 to 1936, declaring he had found evidence supporting the biblical account of Joshua's conquest. Garstang claimed the city's walls had fallen around 1400 BC, precisely when many biblical scholars believed the Israelites had conquered Canaan. For believers and skeptics alike, Jericho represented the ultimate test case where archaeology might prove or disprove sacred scripture. But Kenyon saw something else entirely when she looked at that dusty mound. She saw layers of human occupation stretching back thousands of years, each one with its own story to tell. The problem was that previous excavations had been asking the wrong questions and using methods that destroyed more evidence than they preserved. Garstang had dug broad, sweeping areas looking for impressive walls and dramatic destruction levels. Kenyon was about to introduce an approach that would treat every handful of dirt as a potential historical document. The Wheeler-Kenyon method, as it would come to be known, represented nothing less than a revolution in how archaeologists approached ancient sites. Instead of digging large open areas, Kenyon divided her excavation into precise 5-metre squares separated by narrow walkways called balks. These walkways preserved the vertical faces of the excavation, creating cross-sections through thousands of years of human activity. Every layer, every change in soil colour, every fragment of pottery was carefully measured, drawn, and photographed before being removed. To understand why this was revolutionary, you have to picture how archaeology had been practiced before Kenyon arrived at Jericho. Earlier excavators often worked like miners, digging down through ancient sites in search of spectacular finds. They would remove entire layers of occupation, sometimes discarding what seemed like mundane everyday objects in their rush to reach older, presumably more important levels. The precise relationships between artifacts and their contexts were frequently lost forever. Kenyon's approach was fundamentally different. She treated the site like a complex three-dimensional puzzle where every piece mattered. Her teams would carefully peel back one thin layer at a time, recording exactly where each artifact was found and its relationship to everything around it. The bulks served as permanent witnesses to the excavation process, preserving a record of the site's stratigraphy that could be studied and re-examined long after the dig was complete. This methodical approach immediately began yielding results that challenged everything Garstang had claimed about Jericho. Where he had seen clear evidence of destruction around 1400 BC, Kenyon's careful stratigraphic analysis revealed a much more complex picture. The famous walls that Garstang attributed to Joshua's time were actually much older, dating to the early Bronze Age around 2300 BC. The Middle Bronze Age city, which Garstang had identified as Joshua's Jericho, had indeed been destroyed, but Kenyon's analysis placed this destruction around 1550 BC, well before any plausible date for an Israelite conquest. Even more significantly, Kenyon discovered that there was virtually no occupation at Jericho during the Late Bronze Age, the period when most scholars believe the Israelite conquest should have occurred. If Joshua had led the Israelites against Jericho around 1400 or 1200 BC, there would have been no substantial city there to conquer. The archaeological evidence suggested that Jericho was largely abandoned during precisely the period when the biblical narrative placed its most famous siege. The implications of these findings sent shockwaves through the world of biblical archaeology. For the first time, rigorous archaeological methodology was directly challenging one of the most famous stories in the Hebrew Bible. This wasn't simply a matter of adjusting dates or reinterpreting evidence. Kenyon's work suggested that the entire biblical account of Jericho's conquest might be historically unreliable. But the real revolution Kenyon brought to archaeology extended far beyond any single site or biblical controversy. The Wheeler-Kenyon method she pioneered at Jericho became the standard approach for excavating complex multi-layered sites throughout the Middle East and beyond. Her insistence on precise stratigraphic control and detailed recording transformed archaeology from a treasure-hunting adventure into a rigorous scientific discipline. The method's emphasis on preserving and recording context rather than simply collecting impressive artifacts represented a fundamental shift in archaeological thinking. Kenyon demonstrated that a small pottery shard found in a precisely dated layer could tell historians more about ancient life than a spectacular golden artifact torn from its context. This approach made it possible to construct detailed chronologies of human occupation, track changes in technology and culture over time, and understand how ancient societies responded to challenges like climate change or foreign invasion. Kenyon's work at Jericho also pioneered the integration of new scientific techniques into archaeological practice. She was among the first excavators to make systematic use of radiocarbon dating, which had been developed in the late 1940s. By combining precise stratigraphic control with scientific dating methods, she could establish absolute chronologies that didn't depend on correlations with historical texts or artistic styles. The radiocarbon samples from Jericho provided some of the earliest reliable dates for Palestinian prehistory and early history. These dates confirmed Kenyon's stratigraphic analysis and provided an independent check on the chronologies that archaeologists had constructed based on pottery styles and historical correlations. The combination of stratigraphic excavation and scientific dating created a new foundation for understanding the ancient Middle East that was based on physical evidence rather than textual interpretation. Perhaps most importantly, Kenyon's approach demonstrated that archaeology could function as an independent source of historical information. Before her work at Jericho, archaeologists in Palestine had largely seen themselves as illustrators of biblical history. They assumed that the biblical narrative provided an accurate historical framework, and their job was to find physical evidence that confirmed and illuminated these ancient texts. Kenyon turned this relationship upside down. She showed that archaeological evidence, properly excavated and interpreted, could evaluate and even contradict textual sources. This didn't necessarily mean that the biblical accounts were worthless as historical sources, but it did mean they couldn't be accepted uncritically. Every claim about the ancient past, whether it came from the Bible, classical historians, or archaeological interpretation, had to be tested against the physical evidence. This methodological revolution had profound implications that extended far beyond archaeology. Kenyon's work contributed to the development of biblical criticism as an academic discipline, providing scholars with independent evidence they could use to evaluate ancient texts. Her findings supported scholars who argued that many biblical narratives reflected later theological concerns rather than accurate historical memories. The Wheeler-Kenyon method also transformed archaeological education and practice. Kenyon trained a generation of archaeologists who carried her methods to sites throughout the Middle East, Mediterranean, and beyond. Her students and colleagues adapted her techniques to different types of sites and archaeological problems, creating regional variations while maintaining the core principles of stratigraphic control and detailed recording. The method proved particularly valuable for excavating urban sites with complex occupational histories. Cities like Jerusalem, Babylon, and Troy, which had been inhabited continuously for thousands of years, presented archaeological challenges that earlier methods couldn't handle effectively. The Wheeler-Kenyon approach made it possible to untangle these complex stratigraphic sequences and understand how ancient cities had developed over time. Sir Mortimer Wheeler and Harappa, Indus Valley, 1940s. At 54 years old, Brigadier Robert Eric Mortimer Wheeler stood at a crossroads that would have broken lesser men. The year was 1944, and the Second World War was drawing to its bloody conclusion across Europe and Asia. Wheeler had spent nearly 30 years building a reputation as Britain's most dynamic archaeologist, only to watch 2 world wars tear great holes in his life and career. The trenches of France had claimed many of his contemporaries in the First War, while the Second had pulled him away from archaeology entirely, sending him to North Africa and Italy as an artillery officer. Now, as victory approached, he faced a choice that terrified him more than any German bombardment: retirement from military service and a return to civilian life that might no longer have a place for him. Wheeler was not a man who accepted irrelevance quietly. Born in Scotland in 1890 to a journalist father, he'd shown early signs of the restless energy that would define his entire life. University College London had shaped his academic foundation, but it was the First World War that forged his character. Serving with the Royal Artillery on the Western Front, he had learned to command men under the most desperate circumstances, to make quick decisions when lives hung in the balance, and to project absolute confidence even when the situation seemed hopeless. These were skills that would serve him well in archaeology, though he didn't know it yet. The war had also taught him about loss. His first marriage to Tessa Verney in 1914 had begun with the promise of a shared archaeological career, but Tessa's death from a brain tumour in 1936 had left Wheeler emotionally devastated. She had been more than his wife. She had been his intellectual partner and the co-developer of many excavation techniques that bore both their names. Her death had driven him deeper into his work, but it had also left him profoundly lonely, a condition that would plague him for the rest of his life, despite his later marriage to Mavis de Vere Cole and his numerous romantic entanglements. By 1944, Wheeler had established himself as one of Britain's leading field archaeologists through his excavations at sites like Verulamium and Maiden Castle. His methods were revolutionary, combining military precision with scientific rigour. He treated archaeological sites like military campaigns, with detailed planning, clear chains of command, and systematic recording of every discovery. But the war had interrupted all of this, and now he wondered if the world still needed what he had to offer. The answer came in the form of an unexpected telegram from Delhi. The government of India was offering him the position of Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, the most prestigious archaeological post in the British Empire. For Wheeler, this wasn't just a job opportunity, it was a chance to rebuild his life in a completely new context. India represented everything he had lost and hoped to regain: the possibility of great discoveries, the challenge of unknown civilizations, and the chance to prove that his methods could work on a scale larger than anything he had attempted in Britain. The decision to accept meant leaving behind everything familiar. At 54, Wheeler was starting over in a country where the temperature could reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit, where diseases unknown in Europe could kill within days, and where the political situation was increasingly unstable as independence movements gained momentum. For most men his age, this would have seemed like madness. For Wheeler, it felt like salvation. His arrival in India in 1944 coincided with some of the most dramatic years in the subcontinent's modern history. The independence movement was reaching its climax, and there was growing tension about what would happen to India's archaeological heritage once the British departed. Some Indian intellectuals viewed archaeology as another form of colonial exploitation, a way for foreign scholars to appropriate their country's past. Others recognised the urgent need to document and protect sites that were being threatened by development and neglect. Wheeler found himself walking a delicate line. He was, undeniably, a representative of the colonial system appointed by British authorities to manage Indian heritage. Yet he was also genuinely committed to training Indian archaeologists and ensuring that the country would have the expertise to continue this work after independence. This tension would define his entire tenure in India, making every decision a political act whether he intended it or not. The Archaeological Survey of India that Wheeler inherited in 1944 was in poor condition. Years of war had reduced funding and manpower, while many of the most important sites had been neglected. Previous directors had focused primarily on architectural conservation, treating archaeology more like monument maintenance than scientific investigation. Wheeler immediately recognised that fundamental changes were needed if Indian archaeology was going to meet international standards. His first major decision was to focus on the Indus Valley civilization, one of the world's earliest urban cultures, but one that remained poorly understood. The main sites at Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro had been discovered in the 1920s, but subsequent excavations had been limited in scope and plagued by poor methodology. Wheeler saw an opportunity to apply his systematic approach to one of archaeology's greatest puzzles: what had happened to this sophisticated Bronze Age civilization that had simply vanished from history. The challenge of excavating Harappa appealed to Wheeler's military instincts. This wasn't just an archaeological site, it was a logistical nightmare. Located in what is now Pakistan, Harappa was far from major cities and transportation networks. The climate was brutal, with summer temperatures that could disable equipment and kill workers. Local infrastructure was minimal, meaning that everything from excavation tools to medical supplies had to be transported across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. Wheeler approached these challenges like a military campaign. He established base camps with medical facilities, organised supply lines to ensure regular delivery of equipment and provisions, and recruited teams of workers from local villages. His military experience proved invaluable in managing the complex logistics of a major excavation in a remote location, but it was his archaeological expertise that would make the Harappa excavation a watershed moment in his career. When Wheeler began systematic excavations at Harappa in 1946, he was confronting not just an ancient city but his own assumptions about human civilization. The Indus Valley sites challenged everything that archaeologists thought they knew about early urban development. Unlike Mesopotamian or Egyptian cities, Harappan settlements showed no evidence of monumental temples or royal palaces. The architecture was utilitarian but sophisticated, with advanced sewage systems and standardized brick sizes that suggested centralized planning on a scale unprecedented in the ancient world. For Wheeler, who'd spent his career excavating European sites with clear historical context, the Indus Valley represented a completely different kind of archaeological challenge. There were no written records that could be deciphered, no obvious religious monuments, and no clear evidence of the kind of hierarchical society that characterized other early civilizations. Every conclusion had to be drawn from physical evidence alone, requiring a level of interpretive skill that pushed Wheeler to the limits of his abilities. The discoveries at Harappa began to reshape Wheeler's understanding of his profession and his place in it. Previously, his excavations had been about illuminating known history, using archaeological evidence to flesh out stories that were already recorded in texts. At Harappa, he was dealing with a completely unknown civilization, one that existed only in the artifacts and structures his team uncovered. This required a different kind of archaeological imagination, one that could construct entire social systems from pottery fragments and building foundations. Wheeler's interpretation of Harappa's destruction would become one of his most controversial legacies. Based on evidence of burning and scattered skeletal remains, he proposed that the Indus Valley civilization had been destroyed by invading Aryans, nomadic peoples from Central Asia who brought horses, iron weapons, and a new social order to the Indian subcontinent. This Aryan invasion theory became a cornerstone of South Asian prehistory, though it would later be heavily criticized and largely abandoned by subsequent generations of scholars. The personal impact of the Harappa excavation on Wheeler was profound. For the first time in his career, he was dealing with a civilization that had no connection to European history or classical traditions. This forced him to think beyond the intellectual frameworks that had shaped his earlier work and to consider human development on a global scale. The experience was both humbling and liberating, showing him that his archaeological methods could be applied to any culture, anywhere in the world. The work at Harappa also provided Wheeler with a new sense of purpose at a critical point in his life. The loneliness that had plagued him since Tessa's death was temporarily forgotten in the excitement of discovery. The remote location and difficult conditions created a sense of shared adventure among his team members, fostering relationships that would last long after the excavation ended. For a man who had always been more comfortable leading others than forming intimate connections, the structured environment of an archaeological expedition provided a way to build meaningful human relationships without emotional vulnerability. Wheeler's success at Harappa established his reputation far beyond the archaeological community. His dramatic interpretations and gift for public communication made him one of the first archaeologists to achieve genuine celebrity status. When he returned to Britain in 1948, he found himself in demand as a lecturer, television personality, and popular author. The BBC's quiz show Animal, Vegetable, Mineral made him a household name throughout Britain, introducing archaeology to audiences who had never considered it as anything more than treasure hunting. This transformation from working archaeologist to public intellectual represented yet another reinvention for Wheeler. The man who had begun his career as a specialist in Romano-British archaeology had become television's first archaeological celebrity, capable of making the ancient world accessible to millions of viewers. The irony was not lost on him. His greatest popular success came not from his groundbreaking excavations, but from his ability to discuss other people's discoveries on television. Sir Arthur Evans and Knossos, 1900 to 1930. The mystery began with a handful of small stones, each no bigger than a walnut, carved with strange symbols that no scholar could read. In the spring of 1894, a 43-year-old British gentleman with wire-rimmed spectacles and an insatiable curiosity was wandering through the streets of Athens when he noticed these peculiar objects in an antiquities dealer's shop. The local Cretan women who sold them called them galapetres or milkstones, believing that wearing them would help nursing mothers produce more milk. But Arthur Evans saw something entirely different in those tiny carved seals. He saw hieroglyphs, picture writing that belonged to no known civilization, script that seemed to predate even the earliest Greek alphabet. The dealer's story was frustratingly vague. The stones came from Crete, he said, though he couldn't or wouldn't specify exactly where. Some whispered they were found near the ruins of an ancient city called Knossos, but details remained maddeningly elusive. Evans purchased every seal he could find, but the more he studied them, the deeper the mystery became. The symbols were clearly organized into some kind of writing system, but they bore no resemblance to Egyptian hieroglyphs, Mesopotamian cuneiform, or any other ancient script he knew. The figures depicted on the seals showed scenes of people and animals, religious ceremonies and daily life. But from what civilization? For 6 years, Evans pursued these tantalizing clues across museums, private collections and archaeological sites throughout the Mediterranean. Each new seal he discovered only deepened the puzzle. Some showed scenes of bull leaping, others depicted elegant figures in elaborate dress. The artistic style was sophisticated, clearly the product of an advanced civilization, yet no historical text mentioned such a culture existing in the Aegean. It was as if an entire world had simply vanished from history, leaving behind only these cryptic stone messages. The trail inevitably led Evans to Crete. In 1900, after years of negotiations and bureaucratic delays, he finally secured permission to excavate at Knossos, a site that local tradition claimed held the ruins of an ancient palace. What Evans expected to find was perhaps a modest settlement, maybe some architectural remains that would help him understand the culture that had produced his mysterious seal stones. What he discovered instead would fundamentally challenge everything scholars thought they knew about Bronze Age civilization. On March 23, 1900, just 3 days after beginning excavations, Evans's workmen uncovered the first walls of what would prove to be an enormous building complex. But these weren't the rough stone foundations typical of Bronze Age sites. The walls were made of carefully dressed limestone blocks, fitted together with remarkable precision. More intriguingly, many of the walls showed evidence of having been plastered and painted with elaborate frescoes. This was architecture on a scale and sophistication that seemed impossible for a civilization that supposedly existed over 3,000 years ago. As the excavation progressed through that first season, each new discovery raised more questions than it answered. The building they were uncovering wasn't just large, it was labyrinthine in its complexity. Corridors led to more corridors, rooms opened onto courtyards that connected to other wings of the structure. Stairwells descended multiple levels underground, while other staircases climbed to upper floors that had long since collapsed. The layout seemed almost deliberately confusing, as if designed to disorient visitors who didn't know the proper paths. Then came the breakthrough that would make Evans's reputation forever. In a storage room in the west wing of the complex, workmen uncovered hundreds of clay tablets covered with the same mysterious script Evans had first seen on the seal stones years earlier. But these weren't just individual symbols carved on small seals. These were entire archives, libraries of records written in not one but 2 different scripts that Evans would later designate as Linear A and Linear B. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just evidence of literacy, but of a bureaucratic civilization sophisticated enough to maintain detailed written records. The tablets were clearly administrative documents, lists and inventories that suggested a complex economy involving trade, taxation, and resource management. Some tablets showed pictographs of sheep, cattle, and grain alongside numerical symbols, apparently recording the wealth of the palace. Others bore longer texts that might have been legal documents or religious records. Most remarkably, the newest tablets were written in Linear B, a script that seemed more advanced and systematic than the earlier Linear A. This suggested not just a literate civilization, but one that had evolved its writing system over time. But Evans's most dramatic discovery came in the form of the frescoes that adorned the palace walls. As his team carefully cleaned away centuries of accumulated earth and debris, they revealed paintings of extraordinary beauty and sophistication. The famous bull-leaping fresco showed young athletes somersaulting over charging bulls in what appeared to be a religious or athletic ceremony. The ladies in blue depicted elegant court women with elaborate hairstyles and jewellery, their faces painted with a naturalistic detail that wouldn't be matched in European art for another 1,000 years. The artistic evidence painted a picture of a civilization that seemed almost impossibly advanced for its time. The Prince of Lilies fresco showed a young man with long curled hair wearing a crown of lilies and peacock feathers, his body adorned with jewellery that suggested wealth beyond anything known from other Bronze Age cultures. The dolphin fresco, from what Evans identified as the Queen's Quarters, depicted marine life with such accuracy and artistic sophistication that it rivaled the best classical Greek paintings. Yet perhaps the most mysterious aspect of this civilization was what it lacked. Unlike Egyptian or Mesopotamian sites, Knossos showed no evidence of massive fortifications, no walls designed to keep enemies at bay. There were no obvious royal tombs packed with grave goods, no monumental statues of kings proclaiming their conquests. The architecture suggested a people confident in their security, comfortable with luxury, focused more on art and commerce than on warfare and defence. Evans began to piece together a revolutionary interpretation of what he had found. This wasn't just another Bronze Age settlement, it was the centre of an entirely unknown civilization that had dominated the Eastern Mediterranean 2 millennia before classical Greece. He named this lost world Minoan, after the legendary king Minos of Crete, and proposed that the complex at Knossos was indeed the legendary labyrinth where the mythical Minotaur had been housed. But Evans faced a problem that would plague him for the rest of his career. The remains he was uncovering were fragmentary, damaged by millennia of earthquakes, fires, and human interference. The frescoes existed only in pieces, scattered fragments that had to be reassembled like three-dimensional puzzles. The architecture was largely collapsed, with only foundations and occasional wall sections surviving intact. How could he present this lost civilization to the world, when so much of the evidence was missing or ambiguous? Evans' solution was as controversial as it was ambitious. Rather than simply recording and preserving what remained, he decided to reconstruct the palace as he believed it had originally appeared. Using reinforced concrete, steel supports, and artistic imagination, he began rebuilding Knossos according to his interpretation of the archaeological evidence. Fragmentary frescoes were restored using modern materials and artistic extrapolation. Collapsed sections of the building were rebuilt to suggest their original appearance. The famous throne room was reconstructed with a stone throne surrounded by frescoes of griffins that Evans believed had guarded the Minoan king. The reconstruction project, which continued for nearly 3 decades, transformed Knossos into something unprecedented in archaeology, a Bronze Age palace that visitors could walk through and experience as a living space. The grand staircase was rebuilt to its full height, complete with reproductions of the original columns painted in the distinctive Minoan red and black. The residential quarters were reconstructed with working drainage systems that demonstrated the sophisticated engineering of Minoan civilization. Storage rooms were filled with replica pottery and artifacts that illustrated the wealth and complexity of palace life. Critics immediately questioned Evans's methods and conclusions. How much of what visitors saw at Knossos was authentic Bronze Age architecture, and how much was 20th century imagination? Some of the most famous frescoes, including portions of the Prince of Lilies, were largely reconstructed from tiny fragments using artistic guesswork to fill in the missing pieces. The layout of the upper floors was based on Evans's interpretation of collapsed foundations and wall stubs that might have supported entirely different structures. More fundamentally, scholars began to question whether Evans's interpretation of Minoan civilization was supported by the archaeological evidence or imposed upon it. The peaceful, sophisticated culture he described seemed too good to be true. A Bronze Age utopia that conveniently matched early 20th century ideals of enlightened civilization. The absence of fortifications might indicate not confidence, but weakness. The elaborate art might represent not cultural sophistication, but religious obsession or royal excess. The decipherment of Linear B in 1952 would ultimately vindicate some of Evans's insights while challenging others. Michael Ventress's breakthrough proved that the later script recorded an early form of Greek, suggesting that the final phase of Knossos had been controlled by Mycenaean Greeks rather than Evans's Minoans. This discovery implied a more complex and violent end to Minoan civilization than Evans had envisioned, with conquest rather than natural disaster bringing down the palace culture. Yet, for all the controversies surrounding his methods and interpretations, Evans had achieved something remarkable. Starting with nothing but a handful of mysterious seal stones, he had uncovered evidence of Europe's first advanced civilization and brought it back to life for the modern world. His reconstruction of Knossos, whatever its archaeological limitations, had created a tangible connection between the present and a Bronze Age past that would otherwise have remained invisible to all but specialists. Sir Leonard Woolley and Royal Cemetery of Ur, 1922 to 1934. The telegram arrived at the British Museum on a dusty afternoon in 1922, carrying news that would ignite one of archaeology's greatest controversies. Local workers at the ancient site of Ur in southern Iraq had uncovered something extraordinary, a burial chamber filled with gold artifacts of unprecedented richness. But what truly caught Leonard Woolley's attention as he prepared for the excavation season wasn't just the promise of treasure. It was the deeper question that would define his 12 years at Ur and fundamentally challenge his understanding of how archaeology should work in a world where Western science collided with local knowledge, colonial ambitions, and ancient mysteries that belonged to no single culture. Woolley arrived at Ur in 1922 as the joint director of a British Museum and University of Pennsylvania expedition, but he quickly discovered he was entering a cultural minefield that had been building tension for decades. The site lay in the heart of Mesopotamia, recently carved from the Ottoman Empire and placed under British mandate following World War I. Local Bedouin tribes had known about the ancient ruins for generations, calling the massive ziggurat Tel al-Mukaya and passing down stories about the treasures buried beneath their feet. These weren't just folklore tales. The local people had been finding artifacts at Ur for centuries, selling them in Baghdad markets or to European collectors who rarely asked questions about their origins. The collision between local knowledge and Western archaeological methods became apparent from Woolley's first day at the site. His most trusted ally proved to be Sheikh Hamoudi ibn Ibrahim, a Syrian foreman who had worked with British archaeologists for over 2 decades. Hamoudi possessed an almost supernatural ability to read the earth, identifying promising areas for excavation based on subtle changes in soil colour and texture that escaped Western-trained eyes. Yet despite his expertise, Hamoudi was never considered an archaeologist in the formal sense. He was classified as a local foreman, skilled labour rather than a scholarly colleague, despite the fact that his knowledge of ancient building techniques often surpassed that of university-educated expedition members. This hierarchy created constant tension. Hamoudi and his workers understood the landscape in ways that Woolley's scientific training hadn't prepared him for. They knew which areas were likely to contain burials based on traditional stories passed down through generations. They could predict where underground walls might be located by reading surface features invisible to foreign eyes. Yet their knowledge was systematically excluded from official archaeological reports, dismissed as superstition rather than empirical observation. The resulting excavation strategy combined Western scientific methods with local insights, but the partnership was never acknowledged as such in academic publications. The discovery that would make her famous worldwide came through this uncomfortable collaboration. In 1926, local workers supervised by Hamoudi uncovered what appeared to be a small burial chamber. But as they cleared away the earth, they revealed something that challenged every assumption about ancient Mesopotamian society. The chamber contained the remains of Queen Pwabi, wearing a golden headdress of extraordinary craftsmanship. Surrounding her were the skeletons of dozens of attendants, apparently sacrificed to accompany their ruler into the afterlife. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just a royal burial, but evidence of human sacrifice on a scale that seemed to contradict everything scholars thought they knew about Sumerian civilization. Woolley's interpretation of the royal cemetery discoveries would become one of archaeology's most contested theories. He proposed that the mass burials represented ritual suicide, with court attendants voluntarily drinking poison to join their deceased rulers in the afterlife. This interpretation drew on his understanding of ancient texts and comparative studies of other cultures, but it also reflected distinctly Western assumptions about how ancient societies might have functioned. The idea that dozens of people would willingly die for their rulers appealed to European colonial administrators, familiar with stories of devoted colonial subjects, but it ignored alternative explanations that local scholars and workers might have offered. The local response to Woolley's interpretations revealed the deep cultural divides that characterized archaeological work in the Mandate period. Iraqi intellectuals, many educated in European universities, challenged Woolley's conclusions on both scholarly and political grounds. They argued that his emphasis on human sacrifice reinforced Western stereotypes about Eastern barbarism, portraying ancient Mesopotamian civilization as exotic and violent rather than sophisticated and rational. Some pointed out that Woolley's evidence for voluntary death was circumstantial at best, and that the skeletons might represent plague victims, war casualties, or even later intrusive burials that had nothing to do with royal funerary practices. These criticisms were complicated by the colonial context in which the excavations took place. Iraq's newly established Department of Antiquities was struggling to assert control over archaeological work within its borders, but it lacked the resources and international recognition needed to challenge well-funded Western expeditions. The division of finds between Iraq and the foreign excavators became a constant source of tension. Woolley argued that the spectacular discoveries at Ur deserved to be displayed in major international museums where they would receive proper conservation and scholarly attention. Iraqi officials countered that these artifacts were part of their national heritage and should remain in the country regardless of local museum facilities. The most dramatic confrontation came in 1934, when new Iraqi antiquities laws threatened to reduce the foreign excavators' share of discoveries. Woolley protested vigorously, arguing that the new regulations would make international archaeological work financially impossible and scientifically counterproductive. His arguments reflected genuine concerns about conservation and research access, but they also revealed the colonial assumptions that underpinned much archaeological work of the period. The idea that local governments might have legitimate claims to control their own archaeological heritage was difficult for many Western archaeologists to accept, particularly when those claims conflicted with established museum collections and research programs. The controversy surrounding the Royal Cemetery discoveries was intensified by Woolley's gift for publicity. He understood that spectacular finds and dramatic interpretations would generate the media attention needed to fund continued excavations. His accounts of the royal burials, published in newspapers and popular magazines worldwide, emphasized the exotic and mysterious aspects of the discoveries. The image of Queen Pwabi's golden headdress became an icon of ancient luxury, while stories of mass ritual suicide captured public imagination in ways that more mundane archaeological discoveries never could. But this popular success came at a cost that Woolley didn't fully anticipate. His dramatic interpretations became fixed in public consciousness, making it difficult for later scholars to propose alternative explanations without appearing to diminish the significance of the discoveries. The emphasis on gold and sacrifice overshadowed equally important but less sensational aspects of Ur's history, including evidence for trade networks, technological innovation, and urban planning that revealed the true sophistication of Sumerian civilization. The local workers who made many of the actual discoveries found themselves caught between these competing narratives. Their traditional knowledge of the site was essential to the excavation's success, but their interpretations of the discoveries were rarely recorded or taken seriously by Western archaeologists. Some local workers developed their own theories about the royal burials based on regional folklore and religious traditions, but these alternative perspectives were dismissed as unscientific speculation rather than legitimate scholarly interpretation. The impact of these cultural collisions extended far beyond the specific discoveries at Woolley's excavations, coincided with the emergence of Iraqi nationalism and growing demands for cultural autonomy. His work became a symbol of the broader tensions between Western archaeological institutions and Middle Eastern countries seeking to control their own historical narratives. The spectacular success of the Ur excavations demonstrated the value of archaeological tourism and international prestige, but it also highlighted the unequal relationships that characterized much colonial-era archaeology. The legacy of these tensions would shape Middle Eastern archaeology for decades to come. Woolley's successors found themselves working in an increasingly politicized environment, where every excavation decision carried implications for national identity and cultural ownership. The methods he pioneered for managing large-scale excavations in challenging environments became standard practice throughout the region, but they were always implemented within power structures that privileged Western institutions and perspectives over local knowledge and interests. The transformation in Woolley himself was perhaps the most significant outcome of his 12 years at Ur. He arrived as a relatively conventional British archaeologist, trained in classical methods and comfortable with colonial hierarchies. The extraordinary discoveries he made, facilitated by local knowledge and expertise that he never fully acknowledged, forced him to grapple with questions about cultural ownership and archaeological responsibility that would have been unthinkable to earlier generations of excavators. Howard Carter and King Tutankhamun's Tomb, 1922. The mystery that would consume Howard Carter's life began not with ancient riddles or cryptic hieroglyphs, but with a simple, maddening absence. By 1917, nearly every major tomb in the Valley of the Kings had been discovered, explored, and stripped bare by centuries of grave robbers and decades of archaeological expeditions. The great pharaohs of Egypt's Golden Age had all been accounted for. Ramesses the Great lay in his massive tomb, Setia rested in his painted chambers, and even minor rulers had been found in their rocky sepulchres. But one name remained conspicuously missing from the roll call of discovered royalty: Tutankhamun, the boy king whose reign had lasted only 9 years and whose very existence seemed to hover between history and legend. Carter had arrived in Egypt as a 17-year-old artist in 1891, sketching tomb paintings for archaeological expeditions with hands that trembled more from excitement than youth. By 1917, he was a 43-year-old man whose career had been marked by both remarkable discoveries and devastating setbacks. His work with Flinders Petrie had taught him the painstaking methods of scientific excavation, but his volatile temper had cost him his position as Chief Inspector of Antiquities after a confrontation with French tourists at Saqqara. For years afterward, he'd scraped by selling watercolour paintings to tourists, his archaeological career seemingly finished. The partnership with Lord Carnarvon had offered Carter a lifeline back into serious excavation work, but it came with a price. Carnarvon was a wealthy English aristocrat whose interest in Egyptian antiquities had been sparked by a doctor's recommendation to spend winters in Egypt's warm climate. He possessed the financial resources to fund major expeditions, but he also demanded results that would justify his investment. By 1917, Carter had convinced Carnarvon to pursue the most tantalizing prize in Egyptian archaeology, the undiscovered tomb of Tutankhamun. The evidence for Tutankhamun's existence was frustratingly fragmentary. Theodore Davis, the American millionaire who had held the excavation concession for the Valley of the Kings until 1914, had found scattered artifacts bearing the young pharaoh's name. A small faience cup, some gold foil, and fragments of pottery suggested that Tutankhamun had indeed been buried somewhere in the valley, but Davis had concluded that these remains represented all that survived of the tomb, which he believed had been thoroughly plundered in antiquity. When Davis relinquished his concession in 1914, he famously declared that the Valley of the Kings was exhausted, that there were no more royal tombs to be found. Carter disagreed. His methodical survey of the valley had revealed that one small triangle of ground remained unexcavated, hidden beneath the debris from the construction of the tomb of Ramesses VI. If Tutankhamun's tomb existed anywhere, Carter reasoned, it had to be in this overlooked corner of the valley. But convincing Carnarvon to finance what might prove to be a costly wild goose chase required all of Carter's powers of persuasion. The partnership between the driven archaeologist and the wealthy dilettante was built on mutual dependence, but it was never entirely comfortable for either man. For 5 grueling seasons between 1917 and 1922, Carter's teams moved literally tons of limestone chips and ancient debris, searching for any trace of a tomb entrance in their designated area. The work was backbreaking and seemingly endless. Every promising depression in the rock proved to be a natural formation. Every ancient wall fragment led nowhere. Each season brought fresh disappointments and mounting pressure from Carnarvon, whose patience and financial commitment were being tested by years of fruitless digging. The crisis came in the summer of 1922. Carnarvon summoned Carter to Highclere Castle, his ancestral home in England, for what Carter feared would be their final meeting. The Lord was considering ending his support for the Tutankhamun search and redirecting his archaeological interests to more promising sites. Carter made one last desperate plea: give him one more season, just 3 months, to excavate the final, unexamined area near the tomb of Ramesses VI. If nothing was found by the end of that season, he would abandon the search forever. Carnarvon agreed, but with obvious reluctance. Carter returned to Egypt in October 1922, knowing that his entire career now depended on the next few months. He had staked everything on his conviction that Tutankhamun's tomb lay hidden beneath the debris of the ages, but conviction alone would not pay the bills if he was wrong. At 48 years old, Carter faced the possibility that his life's work would end in failure, and that he would be remembered, if at all, as the archaeologist who spent 6 years and a fortune looking for a tomb that didn't exist. The excavation season began on November 1st, 1922, with Carter's teams working in the shadow of the tourist path to Ramesses VI's tomb. They were literally excavating beneath the feet of visitors who came daily to view the famous painted chambers of the later pharaoh. The irony was not lost on Carter. If Tutankhamun's tomb was indeed hidden here, thousands of tourists had unknowingly walked over it for decades without suspecting the treasures that might lie beneath their feet. On November 4th, 1922, Carter arrived at the excavation site to find unusual excitement among his workers. Hussein Abd el-Rasul, the water boy whose job was to carry jars of drinking water to the dig crews, had made a discovery that would change archaeological history forever. While placing his water jars in a shaded spot near the base of the tomb of Ramesses VI, Hussein had noticed that the sand sounded hollow when his jar touched the ground. Investigation revealed a small depression that, when cleared, exposed the top edge of a stone step cut into the bedrock. Carter's immediate reaction was a mixture of overwhelming excitement and paralysing caution. After 6 years of disappointments, he could hardly dare to believe that this might be the breakthrough he had sought for so long. But the possibility that this step led to nothing more than an ancient foundation or a minor tomb weighed heavily on his mind. He ordered his workers to carefully clear the step and look for more, but as each shovel of sand was removed, his excitement grew. A second step appeared, then a third, then more, clearly forming the beginning of a descending staircase cut into the valley floor. By the end of that first day, Carter's team had exposed 12 steps leading down to what was obviously a sealed doorway. But the most tantalising discovery came when they cleared the upper portion of the door itself. There, pressed into the ancient plaster that sealed the entrance, were the oval cartouches bearing the name of Tutankhamun. Carter stared at those hieroglyphic symbols for long minutes, hardly able to comprehend that his years of searching had finally led him to the tomb of the lost pharaoh. Yet Carter's excitement was tempered by disturbing evidence that the tomb had been entered before. The upper portion of the doorway showed clear signs of having been opened and resealed in antiquity. Ancient tomb robbers had been here, but when, and how much had they taken? Carter faced the agonizing possibility that he had found Tutankhamun's tomb only to discover that it had been stripped bare thousands of years ago, leaving nothing but empty chambers and bitter disappointment. The protocol of archaeological excavation demanded that Carter stop work and cable Lord Carnarvon in England before proceeding further. The partnership agreement between them required that Carnarvon be present for any major discoveries, and opening a pharaoh's tomb certainly qualified as major. But the wait was torture for Carter. He had the sealed entrance to Tutankhamun's tomb literally within reach, but he had to resist the overwhelming temptation to break through the door and discover immediately what lay beyond. Carter's cable to Carnarvon was a masterpiece of restrained excitement. At last have made wonderful discovery in valley, a magnificent tomb with seals intact. Recovered same for your arrival, congratulations. He then ordered his workers to completely rebury the staircase and entrance, both to protect the tomb from potential looters and to preserve the moment of discovery for his patron's arrival. For 2 weeks, Carter camped near the hidden tomb, guarding what might prove to be archaeology's greatest treasure, while waiting for Carnarvon to make the long journey from England to Egypt. Lord Carnarvon arrived in Luxor on November 23rd, accompanied by his daughter Lady Evelyn Herbert, who had developed her own passion for Egyptian archaeology during previous visits to her father's excavations. The trio returned to the tomb site on November 24th, and Carter's workers once again began the careful process of clearing the ancient staircase. As they worked, more evidence of ancient intrusion became apparent. The doorway had clearly been opened and resealed at least twice in antiquity, suggesting that tomb robbers had indeed penetrated the burial chambers. But when Carter's team cleared the bottom of the staircase on November 25th, they made a discovery that offered new hope. Behind the main doorway lay a corridor filled from floor to ceiling with limestone chips and pottery fragments, clearly ancient fill material that had been deliberately placed there to block access to the tomb's interior. If robbers had thoroughly looted the tomb, why would anyone have bothered to refill the entrance corridor so completely? The blocking suggested that something valuable remained inside, something worth protecting even after the tomb had been breached. The moment that would define Carter's legacy came on November 26, 1922. After clearing enough of the corridor fill to reveal a second sealed doorway, Carter made a small hole in the upper left corner of the door and inserted a candle to test for dangerous gases. As his eyes adjusted to the flickering light, he found himself looking into a chamber that defied his wildest expectations. The room was filled with objects of incredible beauty and obvious value: golden animal figures, painted chests, ceremonial beds, chariots, and artifacts whose function he could only guess at in the candlelight. Lord Carnarvon, standing behind Carter in the narrow corridor, could no longer contain his excitement. "Can you see anything?" he asked impatiently. Carter's reply would become one of the most famous quotations in archaeological history. "Yes, wonderful things." But even those words could not adequately convey the magnitude of what Carter was seeing. This was not a plundered tomb containing a few overlooked artifacts. This was an intact pharaoh's burial, the first ever discovered, containing treasures that had lain undisturbed for over 3,000 years. The full magnitude of the discovery would take years to comprehend. As Carter and his team systematically excavated and catalogued the tomb's contents, they found over 5,000 individual objects, ranging from massive golden shrines to tiny pieces of jewellery. The tomb consisted of 4 chambers: the antechamber that Carter had first glimpsed, a smaller annex filled with additional grave goods, a burial chamber containing 4 nested golden shrines that protected the pharaoh's mummy, and a treasury room housing the canopic equipment and additional funerary objects. But the discovery that would transform Carter from working archaeologist into international celebrity was the pharaoh's golden burial mask, found covering the head of Tutankhamun's mummy within the innermost golden coffin. The mask, crafted from over 20 pounds of solid gold and inlaid with precious stones, captured the idealized features of the young king with an artistry that took the breath away from everyone who saw it. It became an instant icon, the face that would forever represent ancient Egypt in the popular imagination. The transformation of Carter's life was immediate and irreversible. The man who had spent decades labouring in obscurity suddenly found himself at the centre of a media storm that reached around the globe. Newspapers competed for exclusive stories about the tomb's treasures, while photographers documented every phase of the excavation work. Carter, who had always been most comfortable working quietly in dusty excavation sites, now found himself expected to pose for publicity photographs, grant interviews to journalists, and explain his discoveries to curious dignitaries who flocked to Luxor to see the tomb that had captured the world's imagination. Sir Flinders Petrie and sequence dating 1880s to 1920s. When William Matthew Flinders Petrie stepped off the boat in Alexandria in 1880, he carried with him an obsession that had consumed his thoughts for months: the precise measurement of the Great Pyramid of Giza. At 27 years old, Petrie was already known in certain circles as a meticulous surveyor, with an almost supernatural attention to detail, but he was hardly considered a professional archaeologist. His formal education had been irregular at best, consisting mainly of lessons from his father and a series of governesses who struggled to contain his restless intellect. Yet within a decade, this self-taught outsider would revolutionize archaeology so completely that scholars would divide the field into 2 eras: before Petrie and after Petrie. The pyramid measurements that had brought Petrie to Egypt were motivated by theories that seem almost quaint today. Like many Victorians, he was fascinated by the idea that the Great Pyramid encoded mathematical and astronomical knowledge far beyond what ancient peoples should have possessed. His father had been convinced that careful measurement would reveal the pyramid's divine proportions and vindicate various mystical theories about ancient wisdom. But when Petrie began his systematic survey of the monument, living in a nearby tomb to save money and working with instruments more precise than any previously used in Egypt, he discovered something that shattered his preconceptions about both the pyramid and archaeology itself. The measurements revealed that the Great Pyramid was indeed a marvel of ancient engineering, but it was a thoroughly human marvel. The precision was remarkable but not supernatural. The errors were those of skilled craftsmen working under real-world constraints, and the overall design reflected practical decisions rather than mystical mathematics. More importantly, Petrie realized that his careful recording methods were revealing aspects of ancient construction techniques that no one had previously understood. Every stone placement, every slight deviation from perfect alignment, every trace of ancient tool marks was telling a story about how the pyramid had actually been built. This revelation transformed Petrie's approach to the ancient world. Instead of looking for confirmation of preconceived theories, he began to see archaeological sites as vast repositories of information that could be decoded through systematic observation and recording. But the methods that worked for surveying monuments were inadequate for excavating the complex multi-layered sites that characterized most ancient settlements. Petrie needed to develop entirely new approaches to archaeological investigation, and his opportunity came when he turned his attention to Egypt's prehistoric past. In 1894, Petrie began excavating at Nakada, a cemetery site in Upper Egypt that contained thousands of graves from periods that preceded the rise of the pharaohs. Previous excavators had focused on finding spectacular artifacts for museum collections, paying little attention to the precise relationships between different burials or the subtle changes in grave goods that might indicate chronological development. Petrie approached Nakada with the same systematic mindset he had brought to pyramid measurement, but he soon realized that prehistoric cemeteries presented challenges that required revolutionary new methods. The problem was dating. Historical Egyptian sites could be dated using hieroglyphic inscriptions that mentioned known pharaohs or historical events, but the prehistoric graves at Nakada contained no such textual references. The pottery vessels, stone tools, and personal ornaments found in the graves were clearly ancient, but determining their relative ages seemed impossible using conventional archaeological approaches. Some graves were obviously earlier than others based on their depth in the ground, but stratigraphic relationships were often unclear in cemetery contexts where later burials had disturbed earlier ones. Petrie's breakthrough came from his observation that the pottery styles found in different graves showed subtle but consistent patterns of variation. Some vessel shapes appeared frequently in certain graves, but were completely absent from others. Decorative motifs seemed to evolve gradually, with simple geometric patterns giving way to more complex designs, which in turn were replaced by entirely different artistic styles. Most intriguingly, these stylistic changes appeared to correlate with other aspects of the grave assemblages, suggesting that they reflected genuine chronological development rather than random variation. The solution Petrie devised was as elegant as it was revolutionary. He created detailed drawings of every pottery vessel found at Nakada, then arranged them in sequences based on their stylistic characteristics. Vessels with similar shapes and decorations were grouped together, then these groups were arranged in order based on the assumption that styles changed gradually over time. Simple forms were presumed to be earlier than complex ones, geometric decorations were thought to precede naturalistic designs, and technological innovations were assumed to represent later developments. This method, which Petrie called sequence dating, allowed him to create a relative chronology for the Nakada cemetery that extended back centuries before the earliest historical records. He divided the prehistoric period into a series of numbered phases, with SD 30, 62 representing the earliest pre-dynastic culture, and SD 63, 80 covering the latest prehistoric phases immediately before the unification of Egypt. Each phase was characterized by distinctive pottery types, burial customs, and artifact styles that allowed archaeologists to date newly discovered sites by comparing their material assemblages to Petrie's master sequence. The implications of sequence dating extended far beyond Egyptian prehistory. For the first time in archaeological history, scholars had a systematic method for creating chronologies in the absence of written records. The technique could theoretically be applied to any archaeological culture that produced pottery or other artifacts that changed over time, opening up vast new possibilities for studying prehistoric societies worldwide. More fundamentally, Petrie had demonstrated that material culture itself could serve as a kind of historical document, encoding information about chronological development, cultural change, and social evolution. But Petrie's methodological innovations went beyond chronology. His work at Nakada and other Egyptian sites established new standards for excavation recording that would become the foundation of modern archaeological practice. Every artifact was assigned a unique catalogue number linked to detailed information about its find spot, stratigraphic context, and associated materials. Photographs documented the excavation process at every stage, while detailed drawings preserved information about artifact styles and decorative details that photographs couldn't capture adequately. This systematic approach to recording transformed archaeology from treasure hunting into scientific investigation. Previous excavators had focused primarily on spectacular discoveries, often discarding or ignoring mundane artifacts that didn't seem museum-worthy. Petrie demonstrated that pottery sherds, stone tools, and other everyday objects contained information about ancient life that was often more valuable than gold jewellery or monumental art. His detailed catalogues and systematic collections made it possible for future scholars to re-examine his discoveries and test new hypotheses against the accumulated evidence. The revolution in archaeological thinking that Petrie initiated became even more apparent when he applied his methods to sites outside Egypt. In 1890, he conducted a brief but influential excavation at Tel el-Hesi in Palestine, where he introduced stratigraphic excavation techniques to a region where archaeology had previously consisted mainly of treasure hunting expeditions. His 6-week season at Tel el-Hesi established the basic principles that would guide Palestinian archaeology for decades. Careful attention to the vertical sequence of occupational layers, systematic recording of pottery types found in each stratum, and correlation of local ceramic sequences with dated materials from Egypt and other regions. The Tel el-Hesi excavation demonstrated that Petrie's methods could be successfully adapted to different types of sites and archaeological problems. The techniques he had developed for cemetery excavation proved equally valuable for investigating urban sites with complex histories of construction, destruction, and rebuilding. The sequence dating principles that had worked with Egyptian pottery could be applied to Palestinian ceramics, Mesopotamian artifacts, or any other archaeological assemblage that showed stylistic change over time. Perhaps most importantly, Petrie's work at Tel el-Hesi established archaeology as a truly international discipline. His methods provided a common language that archaeologists working in different regions could use to communicate about chronological relationships, cultural connections, and historical processes. A pottery type documented in Palestine could be compared systematically with similar vessels from Egypt, Cyprus, or Anatolia, making it possible to trace ancient trade networks, population movements, and cultural exchanges across vast geographical areas. The transformation that Petrie brought to archaeological thinking was perhaps most evident in his approach to publication and scholarly communication. His excavation reports set new standards for comprehensive documentation, including detailed artifact catalogues, stratigraphic diagrams, and comparative analyses that made his discoveries accessible to scholars worldwide. He pioneered the use of statistical analysis in archaeology, counting and measuring artifacts to identify patterns that might not be apparent from casual observation. His publications demonstrated that archaeological research could be as rigorous and systematic as any other scientific discipline. Petrie's influence on archaeological education was equally revolutionary. His field schools in Egypt trained generations of archaeologists who carried his methods to excavations throughout the Middle East, Mediterranean, and beyond. Students learned not just excavation techniques, but also approaches to problem-solving, data analysis, and scholarly interpretation that would define archaeological practice for decades. The Petrie method became synonymous with scientific archaeology, establishing standards that distinguished professional excavation from amateur antiquities collecting. The broader scientific revolution that Petrie initiated extended beyond archaeology to influence related disciplines, including anthropology, art history, and ancient history. His demonstration that material culture could be analysed systematically provided scholars in these fields with new types of evidence for studying human societies and cultural development. Museum curators began to organise collections according to chronological and cultural criteria rather than purely aesthetic considerations. While ancient historians learned to use archaeological evidence as an independent source of information about past societies, Dorothy Garrod and Mount Carmel Caves, 1929 to 1934. In the autumn of 1921, a 29-year-old woman walked through the gates of Oxford University to begin studies that would seem almost impossibly ambitious to anyone who knew her story. Dorothy Annie Elizabeth Garrod had spent the previous 3 years drifting between temporary jobs and volunteer work, seemingly unable to find her place in a world that had been fundamentally altered by the Great War. Her life had been marked by a series of devastating losses that might have broken a weaker spirit. The death of her beloved brother Tom in the trenches of France, the collapse of the comfortable upper-middle-class world she had known at Newnham College, Cambridge, and the growing realization that the career in history she had once envisioned was closed to women in post-war Britain. Yet, as she signed up for Oxford's diploma in prehistoric archaeology, Dorothy Garrod was about to embark on a journey that would transform not only her own life, but the entire discipline of prehistoric studies. The woman who entered Oxford that autumn was already 30 years old, an age when most of her contemporaries had settled into marriage and family life, or resigned themselves to spinsterhood and limited career options. Garrod had been born into privilege in 1892, the daughter of Sir Archibald Garrod, a distinguished physician who would later become the Regius Professor of Medicine at Oxford. Her childhood had been spent in the refined intellectual atmosphere of late Victorian academia, where scholarly discussion was as natural as breathing, and where her quick mind and fierce independence had been encouraged by parents who believed in education for their daughters as well as their sons. Her undergraduate years at Newnham College, Cambridge, from 1913 to 1916, had coincided with some of the most dramatic changes in British society. She had arrived as an eager 18-year-old planning to study history, but the war that began in her second year altered everything. Her brother Tom, with whom she shared a particularly close bond, enlisted immediately and was killed in action in 1915. The loss devastated Dorothy in ways that she would never fully discuss publicly. But those who knew her well understood that Tom's death had fundamentally changed her relationship with the world and her place in it. The war years at Cambridge had been unlike anything previous generations of students had experienced. Young men disappeared from lecture halls and college corridors, many never to return. The women students found themselves taking on responsibilities and roles that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. Dorothy threw herself into war work, initially serving as a nurse and later working in intelligence, but the experience left her profoundly unsettled about her future. The comfortable assumptions about women's roles and limitations that had shaped her upbringing were crumbling around her, but what would replace them remained unclear. After completing her degree in 1916, Dorothy had spent several restless years trying to find a meaningful career. She worked briefly as a secretary, tried her hand at journalism, and even considered emigrating to Canada or Australia, where she hoped opportunities for women might be greater. But nothing satisfied her restless intelligence or provided the sense of purpose she craved. The turning point came during a family holiday in Malta in 1919, where her father was serving as a consulting physician to the military garrison. Wandering through the ancient ruins scattered across the island, Dorothy found herself fascinated by the physical remains of prehistoric cultures that seemed to offer direct contact with humanity's earliest chapters. This fascination with prehistory represented more than just intellectual curiosity for Dorothy. Unlike historical studies, which were dominated by written sources and traditional narratives that largely excluded women, prehistoric archaeology offered the possibility of uncovering stories that had never been told before. The Stone Age peoples who had lived in caves and created the first art had no written records to privilege male perspectives or political histories. Their story could only be told through the patient excavation and interpretation of material remains, work that required the kind of meticulous attention to detail and analytical thinking at which Dorothy excelled. The decision to pursue formal training in prehistoric archaeology at Oxford was both practical and revolutionary. Practical because it offered Dorothy a path toward a legitimate academic career at a time when such opportunities for women were extremely rare. Revolutionary because it meant entering a field that was still largely undefined, where the rules and hierarchies that restricted women's advancement in other disciplines had not yet been firmly established. Dorothy understood that she was taking an enormous risk, but she also sensed that this new field might offer her the chance to make contributions that would be impossible in more traditional academic subjects. Her studies at Oxford introduced her to the leading figures in European prehistory, including the Abbé Broil, whose work on Paleolithic cave art had revolutionized understanding of Ice Age cultures. More importantly, it provided her with rigorous training in excavation techniques, artifact analysis, and comparative studies that would form the foundation of her later achievements. But perhaps the most significant aspect of her Oxford years was the growing confidence that she could succeed in this demanding field despite the barriers that confronted women in academia. Dorothy's first independent excavation in 1925 at the Devil's Tower rock shelter in Gibraltar established her reputation as a skilled and innovative field archaeologist. The site yielded important Neanderthal remains and provided new insights into the behaviour of Ice Age populations. But more significantly for Dorothy's career, it demonstrated that she could manage complex excavations and produce scholarship that met the highest international standards. The success at Gibraltar opened doors to more ambitious projects and established the network of professional relationships that would sustain her throughout her career. The invitation to excavate the Mount Carmel caves in Palestine came in 1928 from the British School of Archaeology in Jerusalem, but it represented an opportunity that was both exciting and daunting. The caves had been discovered only recently, and preliminary investigations suggested they contained deposits spanning tens of thousands of years of human occupation. For Dorothy, this meant the chance to investigate some of the most important questions in human evolution. How had modern humans evolved from earlier forms? When and how had they spread out of Africa? What was the relationship between Neanderthals and the ancestors of contemporary populations? But the Mount Carmel project also meant taking on responsibilities that would test every aspect of Dorothy's professional and personal capabilities. The excavation would require managing large teams of local workers, coordinating with international colleagues, and maintaining the precise standards of recording and analysis that were essential for addressing complex evolutionary questions. More challenging still, she would be working as a woman in a field dominated by men, in a region where cultural expectations about gender roles were even more restrictive than those she had encountered in Britain. The physical demands of the Mount Carmel excavations were unlike anything Dorothy had previously experienced. The caves were located on steep hillsides that required difficult climbs carrying heavy equipment and supplies. The work itself involved crawling through narrow passages, excavating in cramped conditions with poor lighting, and spending long hours in dusty, uncomfortable environments. The climate was harsh, alternating between blazing heat and bitter cold depending on the season. For a woman who had been raised in comfortable middle-class surroundings, these conditions represented a complete transformation of her daily life. Yet it was precisely these challenges that revealed Dorothy's extraordinary determination and resilience. She adapted to the physical demands of cave excavation with a matter-of-fact competence that impressed even the most skeptical observers. Her small stature, which some had seen as a disadvantage in field archaeology, proved to be an asset in the cramped conditions of the caves. Her meticulous approach to recording and analysis ensured that every discovery was properly documented and preserved for future study. The discoveries that emerged from the Mount Carmel caves between 1929 and 1934 would revolutionize understanding of human evolution and establish Dorothy as one of the world's leading prehistoric archaeologists. The Taban Cave contained a complete stratigraphic sequence spanning over 600,000 years of human occupation, while the School Cave yielded the remains of early modern humans that provided crucial evidence for understanding the transition from archaic to modern populations. Most dramatically, the excavations revealed evidence that Neanderthals and early modern humans had coexisted in the same region, challenging prevailing theories about human evolution and migration. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the Mount Carmel discoveries was what they revealed about Dorothy herself. The shy, uncertain young woman who had struggled to find her direction after the war had been transformed into a confident, internationally respected scientist, capable of leading major research projects and making groundbreaking discoveries. The excavations had demanded not only technical expertise, but also leadership skills, diplomatic abilities, and the kind of intellectual courage required to challenge established theories with new evidence. The personal cost of this transformation was considerable. Dorothy's single-minded focus on her career meant sacrificing the conventional life of marriage and family that most women of her generation expected. Her devotion to archaeology required spending months each year in remote locations, often under difficult and dangerous conditions. The work was physically demanding and emotionally isolating, particularly for a woman working in a field where she had few female colleagues and where her presence was sometimes resented or questioned by male contemporaries. Yet Dorothy seemed to find in archaeology something that compensated for these sacrifices. The work provided her with a sense of purpose and accomplishment that she'd never experienced in more conventional roles. The discoveries at Mount Carmel established her international reputation and opened the door to the ultimate recognition. Her election in 1939 as the first woman professor at Cambridge University, occupying the Disney Chair of Archaeology that had been specifically created to acknowledge her contributions to the field. Donald Johansson and Lucy, 1974. The mystery began in 1972 with fragments that made no sense. French geologist Maurice Taïeb had discovered fossil deposits in the Hadar region of Ethiopia's Afar Triangle that seemed almost too good to be true. The sedimentary layers were perfectly preserved, dating back millions of years, and scattered across the ancient lake beds were tantalizing pieces of bone that suggested this remote corner of Africa might hold secrets about humanity's deepest past. But when 29-year-old Donald Johansson first examined Tayyib's fossil fragments in a Paris laboratory, he faced a puzzle that would consume the next phase of his career. These bones belonged to creatures that didn't fit any known categories of human ancestors. Johansson had arrived at this moment through a path that mixed academic ambition with pure chance. Growing up in Chicago as the son of Swedish immigrants, he had discovered his passion for anthropology almost by accident during his undergraduate years at the University of Illinois. A single course on human evolution had ignited an obsession that led him to graduate school at the University of Chicago, where he specialized in the analysis of fossil teeth and jaws. By 1970, he was part of an expedition to the Omo Valley in Kenya, learning fieldwork techniques under the guidance of established researchers and beginning to understand the complexities of searching for human origins in the harsh landscapes of East Africa. The Omo expedition had provided Johansson with crucial experience, but it had also introduced him to the fierce competitive atmosphere that characterized paleoanthropology in the early 1970s. The field was dominated by a few powerful personalities, most notably the Leakey family, whose discoveries at Olduvai Gorge and other East African sites had revolutionized understanding of human evolution. But the Leakey's interpretations of human ancestry were increasingly being challenged by new discoveries and analytical techniques, and young researchers like Johansson found themselves caught between competing theories about how and when human characteristics had evolved. When Tayyib invited Johansson to join the newly formed International Afar Research Expedition in 1973, the young American recognized an unprecedented opportunity. The Hadar region was virtually unexplored by paleoanthropologists, meaning that any discoveries there would be completely fresh rather than reinterpretations of previously known material. More importantly, the geological conditions at Hadar seemed ideal for preserving ancient fossils, with volcanic ash layers that could be precisely dated and sedimentary deposits that had protected organic remains for millions of years. The first season at Hadar in 1973 had been promising but frustrating. Johansson and his colleagues found numerous fossil fragments, including pieces of early hominid jaws and teeth that suggested the presence of human ancestors dating back over 3 million years. But the material was fragmentary and difficult to interpret. Each new discovery raised more questions than it answered, and Johansson returned to Cleveland after that first season with tantalizing clues, but no breakthrough discoveries that would establish his reputation in the competitive world of paleoanthropology. The 1974 season began with high expectations, but immediate setbacks. The team had expanded to include researchers from several countries, creating logistical challenges in the remote desert location. Equipment failures and supply problems plagued the early weeks of the expedition, while the fossil discoveries remained frustratingly fragmentary. By late November, Johansson was feeling the pressure of leading an international expedition that had consumed significant resources but had yet to produce the kind of spectacular discovery that would justify the investment. November 24, 1974 began like many other days that season. Johansson and graduate student Tom Gray were conducting a systematic survey of a gully system known as Locality 162, an area they had previously explored without finding significant fossils. The morning was already becoming uncomfortably hot, and both men were eager to complete their survey and return to the relative comfort of base camp. They had been working in the field for weeks, and the repetitive nature of fossil hunting was beginning to wear on their enthusiasm. The first clue came when Gray spotted what appeared to be a piece of arm bone lying on the surface of the gully floor. In itself, this was not particularly exciting. Isolated bone fragments were common finds at Hadar, and most proved to belong to extinct species of pigs, antelopes, or other animals rather than human ancestors. But as Johansson bent down to examine the bone more closely, he realized that its size and shape suggested it might be from a hominid, one of the bipedal primates that represented humanity's ancestral line. What happened next would become one of the most famous moments in the history of paleoanthropology. As Johansson and Gray searched the area around the first bone fragment, they began discovering additional pieces: a section of skull, fragments of a spine, parts of a pelvis, pieces of leg bones. Each new discovery increased their excitement, but it also raised an almost impossible possibility. Individual hominid fossils were rare enough. Finding multiple bones from the same individual was virtually unprecedented in paleoanthropology. The mounting evidence that they were looking at a single skeleton created a kind of electric tension between the two men. They had found hominid fossils before, but always as isolated teeth or bone fragments that provided limited information about the ancient creatures they represented. A complete or even partially complete skeleton would be an extraordinary discovery, one that could revolutionize understanding of early human evolution. But neither man dared to voice this possibility as they carefully collected bone after bone from the ancient sediments. By noon they had recovered dozens of fossil fragments, and Johansson was beginning to believe they might indeed have found a single individual. The bones all seemed to be the right size to belong to the same creature, and there was no evidence of duplication that would suggest multiple individuals. More importantly, the bones were providing a three-dimensional picture of an ancient human ancestor that was unlike anything previously discovered. This creature had been bipedal, walking upright like modern humans, but it had also retained primitive characteristics that suggested it was much more ancient than any previously known hominid. The drive back to camp that afternoon was filled with barely controlled excitement. Johansson and Gray had to resist the temptation to examine their finds immediately, knowing that proper analysis would require careful laboratory work and consultation with other team members. But both men understood that they had potentially made a discovery that would transform their careers and challenge existing theories about human evolution. The celebration that evening at the Hadar base camp would become legendary in paleoanthropological circles. As word spread among the expedition members about the day's discoveries, the mood became increasingly festive. Someone had brought a tape player to camp, and as the team examined the fossil bones by lamplight, the Beatles' song "Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds" played repeatedly in the background. The combination of scientific excitement and the hypnotic rhythm of the music created an atmosphere that nobody present would ever forget. It was during this celebration that the skeleton received the name that would make it famous worldwide. The repetition of the Beatles' song had made Lucy a natural choice for the ancient female whose bones they were studying, but the name also reflected something deeper about the discovery's significance. This wasn't just another fossil specimen to be catalogued and stored in a museum. This was Lucy, an individual who had lived and died over 3 million years ago, but whose remains would transform understanding of human origins. The initial analysis of Lucy's skeleton revealed discoveries that challenged fundamental assumptions about human evolution. The completeness of the remains, representing about 40% of the entire skeleton, allowed researchers to reconstruct Lucy's appearance and behaviour in unprecedented detail. She had stood about 3.5 feet tall and weighed perhaps 60 pounds, making her much smaller than modern humans. But her pelvis and leg bones clearly showed that she had walked upright on 2 legs, a distinctly human characteristic that had previously been thought to evolve much later in human development. Perhaps most surprisingly, Lucy's brain case was very small, similar in size to that of a modern chimpanzee. This discovery challenged the long-held assumption that brain expansion had been the driving force in human evolution. Lucy proved that bipedalism had evolved long before the dramatic increase in brain size that characterized later human ancestors, suggesting that the ability to walk upright had been the crucial innovation that set human ancestors apart from their ape relatives. The implications of Lucy's discovery extended far beyond anatomy and behaviour. The dating of the Hadar sediments placed Lucy at 3.2 million years old, making her the oldest relatively complete human ancestor ever discovered. This extreme antiquity forced researchers to reconsider the timing of human evolution and the relationships between different fossil species. Lucy belonged to a species that Johansson and his colleagues named Australopithecus afarensis, and her characteristics suggested that this species might be the common ancestor from which multiple later human lineages had evolved. But Lucy's significance went beyond her scientific importance. The completeness of her remains and the evocative story of her discovery captured public imagination in ways that previous fossil discoveries never had. Johansson's popular books about Lucy and his frequent television appearances made her the most famous fossil in the world, a prehistoric celebrity whose image appeared on magazine covers and museum posters worldwide. Lucy became the public face of human evolution, making abstract scientific concepts accessible to millions of people who had never previously thought about their ancient ancestry. The transformation of Johansson's career was immediate and dramatic. The graduate student who had been uncertain about his future in paleoanthropology suddenly found himself at the centre of international attention. Lucy's discovery made him one of the most recognisable scientists in the world, leading to book contracts, television appearances, and speaking engagements that would sustain his career for decades. But this fame also brought challenges that Johansson had not anticipated, including fierce criticism from established researchers who questioned his interpretations and resented his public prominence. The most dramatic confrontation came in the form of a public debate with Richard Leakey, son of the famous fossil hunting family and a prominent paleoanthropologist in his own right. Leakey challenged Johansson's claim that Australopithecus afarensis was the common ancestor of all later human species, arguing instead that Lucy represented a side branch of human evolution that had gone extinct without contributing to modern human ancestry. The debate, conducted on television and in scientific journals, became one of the most public disagreements in the history of paleoanthropology. Tessa Wheeler and Verulamium, 1930s. In 1893, in the dusty streets of Johannesburg during the height of South Africa's gold rush, a baby girl was born who would grow up to revolutionise archaeological methodology in ways that would echo through the discipline for generations. Tessa Verney entered the world at a time when the British Empire was at its zenith, and when the idea of a woman leading major archaeological excavations would have seemed as fantastical as travelling to the moon. Yet by the time she reached her 40s, this quiet, methodical woman would have co-developed techniques that transformed archaeology from amateur antiquarianism into rigorous scientific investigation, only to have her contributions largely forgotten when death claimed her at the peak of her career. The Verney family's move from South Africa to Britain when Tessa was still young brought her into the heart of Edwardian society, where intellectual curiosity was encouraged in young women even if professional careers remained largely closed to them. At University College London from 1911 to 1914, Tessa threw herself into the study of history with an intensity that surprised her professors. She was particularly drawn to the material culture of the past, the physical objects that previous generations had left behind as evidence of their daily lives. While her classmates focused on political events and great figures, Tessa found herself fascinated by pottery fragments, building foundations, and the mundane artifacts that revealed how ordinary people had actually lived. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 coincided with Tessa's graduation, and like many women of her generation, she found her carefully laid plans disrupted by global events that demanded new roles and responsibilities. But it was also during the war that she met Robert Eric Mortimer Wheeler, a young artillery officer whose passion for archaeology matched her own. Their courtship unfolded against the backdrop of a world in crisis, and when they married in 1914, both understood that they were entering not just a personal partnership, but a professional collaboration that would define their entire careers. The early years of their marriage were marked by the constant uncertainty of wartime separation and the growing recognition that Tessa possessed archaeological skills that were at least equal to those of her more famous husband. While Mortimer served on the Western Front, Tessa continued her studies and began developing the systematic approaches to artifact analysis that would later become central to the Wheeler method. She understood intuitively that archaeology's future lay not in the spectacular discovery of individual treasures, but in the patient accumulation of data about how ancient societies had functioned. When the war ended in 1918, the Wheelers faced the challenge of building careers in a field that was still largely amateur and dominated by wealthy collectors and gentlemen scholars. Mortimer's military experience had given him valuable skills in organisation and leadership, but it was Tessa's analytical mind and attention to detail that would prove crucial to their archaeological success. Their early excavations in Wales and southern England established them as a formidable team, but it was clear that Tessa's contributions were often overlooked by a profession that was not yet ready to acknowledge women as equal partners in archaeological research. The opportunity that would define their partnership came in 1930 when they were invited to excavate Verulamium, the Roman town that lay beneath the medieval city of St Albans in Hertfordshire. The site presented enormous challenges. Previous excavations had been haphazard affairs that had disturbed ancient layers without adequate recording, while the complexity of nearly 2,000 years of continuous occupation meant that untangling the archaeological sequence would require unprecedented precision and methodology. For Tessa, Verulamium represented the chance to apply and refine the systematic approaches she had been developing throughout the 1920s. The excavation techniques that Tessa developed at Verulamium would revolutionize archaeology, though her role in their creation would be largely forgotten after her death. Working closely with Mortimer, but often taking the lead in developing specific methodologies, she pioneered the use of precise grid systems that divided excavation areas into manageable units while maintaining exact spatial relationships between discoveries. Each artifact was recorded not just by type and date, but by its precise three-dimensional position within the site, creating a database of information that could be analysed statistically to reveal patterns invisible to earlier generations of archaeologists. Perhaps even more importantly, Tessa developed new approaches to stratigraphic excavation that allowed archaeologists to distinguish between different periods of occupation even when the physical differences were subtle. Her eye for soil colours, her ability to detect the faint traces of ancient walls and floors, and her insistence on photographing and drawing every stage of the excavation process created records of unprecedented detail and accuracy. These techniques, which would later be refined by Kathleen Kenyon and become known as the Wheeler-Kenyon method, established the foundation for modern archaeological practice. The personal cost of this professional success was enormous. The Verulamium excavations demanded 12-hour days in all weather conditions, crawling through muddy trenches and spending hours bent over artifact tables making detailed drawings and measurements. Tessa's small stature and chronic health problems made this physical labour particularly challenging, but she refused to delegate the most crucial tasks to others. She understood that the methodology they were developing required the kind of personal attention to detail that could not be entrusted to assistants, no matter how skilled. The discoveries at Verulamium were spectacular by any measure. The Wheeler team uncovered extensive remains of Roman buildings, including a theatre, temples and residential areas that provided unprecedented insights into urban life in Roman Britain. But for Tessa, the real triumph lay not in individual discoveries, but in the demonstration that systematic excavation could reconstruct entire communities from their physical remains. The pottery sequences she developed allowed archaeologists to date Romano-British sites with precision previously thought impossible, while her analysis of building techniques and urban planning revealed how Roman civilization had adapted to British conditions. Yet even as professional success brought international recognition to the Wheeler partnership, Tessa was struggling with personal challenges that she rarely discussed publicly. The intense focus on work that had made their archaeological success possible had come at the cost of other aspects of life. The couple had no children, partly by choice but partly due to health problems that plagued Tessa throughout her adult life. The physically demanding nature of excavation work was taking an increasing toll on her constitution, while the constant pressure to produce results and secure funding created stress that affected her overall well-being. The transformation that the Verulamium work brought to Tessa's worldview was profound. When she'd begun her archaeological career, she'd shared the common assumption that the purpose of excavation was to recover beautiful objects for museum display. By the mid-1930s, she'd come to understand that archaeology's real value lay in its ability to reconstruct the social and economic systems of past societies. The Roman artifacts they were uncovering at Verulamium were not just evidence of ancient craftsmanship, but clues to understanding how Roman Britain had functioned as an integrated society. This intellectual evolution coincided with growing recognition of Tessa's importance as an archaeological innovator. International colleagues began to seek her advice on excavation techniques, while younger archaeologists competed for positions on her excavation teams. She was elected to the Society of Antiquaries in 1925, one of the first women to receive this recognition, and her publications were beginning to influence archaeological practice throughout Britain and Europe. For a woman who had entered the field at a time when female professionals were almost unknown, this recognition represented an extraordinary achievement. But the success came with pressures that Tessa found increasingly difficult to manage. The Wheeler method required enormous attention to detail and systematic recording that made excavations far more expensive and time-consuming than traditional approaches. Funding organisations expected dramatic discoveries that would capture public attention, while Tessa's emphasis on methodology sometimes produced results that were scientifically important but difficult to explain to non-specialists. the constant need to justify their approach, while simultaneously developing new techniques, created stress that began to affect her health in ways that became increasingly apparent to those who worked closely with her. The symptoms began subtly during the 1935 excavation season at Verulamium. Colleagues noticed that Tessa seemed more forgetful than usual, occasionally losing track of conversations or appearing confused about excavation procedures that she had developed herself. Initially, these episodes were attributed to overwork and the accumulated stress of years of intensive field work. But as the symptoms became more frequent and severe, it became clear that something more serious was affecting her mental capabilities. The diagnosis, when it finally came in early 1936, was devastating. Tessa was suffering from a brain tumour that was already too advanced for the medical treatments available at the time. The woman who had spent her career analysing the physical remains of the past was facing the reality that her own physical existence was rapidly approaching its end. She was only 43 years old, at the height of her intellectual powers and professional influence, but the disease was progressing rapidly, and there was little that could be done to halt its advance. The final months of Tessa's life revealed the true measure of her character and the depth of her commitment to archaeology. Despite increasing weakness and confusion, she continued to work on the analysis of the Verulamium discoveries, determined to complete the systematic recording and publication that she knew were essential to the project's scientific value. Her last major contribution was the completion of the pottery analysis that would allow future archaeologists to date Romano-British sites using the sequences she had painstakingly developed over years of careful study. Tessa Wheeler died on April 15, 1936, leaving behind a transformed discipline but also a professional partnership that could never be replicated. The methodological innovations she had developed would continue to influence archaeology for decades, refined by scholars like Kathleen Kenyon, who understood their importance even if they could never fully replace Tessa's intuitive genius for reading archaeological evidence. The Wheeler-Kenyon method became the standard approach for excavating complex urban sites throughout the Mediterranean and Middle East, establishing principles of stratigraphic control and systematic recording that remained central to archaeological practice. Javier Urcid and Zapotec hieroglyphs, 1990s to 2000s. Something extraordinary was hiding in plain sight on the carved stone monuments of Monte Alban, and for over half a century nobody had been able to read it. The ancient Zapotec capital that crowned a mountaintop in Mexico's Oaxaca Valley was covered with hieroglyphic inscriptions that seemed to mock every attempt at decipherment. Unlike Maya glyphs, which had yielded their secrets to determined epigraphers in the 1960s and 1970s, the Zapotec script remained stubbornly silent. Scholars could identify individual symbols and even recognize repeated patterns, but the meaning of these carved messages from one of Mesoamerica's earliest literate civilizations remained locked away, as impenetrable as when the first archaeologists had discovered them decades earlier. The challenge that would define Javier Urcid's career began in the early 1990s when he arrived at Monte Alban as a graduate student, armed with new methodologies and a fresh perspective on what many considered an impossible task. The Zapotec script represented far more than just another archaeological puzzle. These hieroglyphs constituted the earliest writing system yet discovered in the Americas, predating even the well-known Maya texts by several centuries. If they could be deciphered, they would revolutionize understanding not only of Zapotec civilization, but of how literacy had first developed in the New World. Previous attempts to crack the Zapotec code had foundered on fundamental methodological problems. Early researchers had approached the inscriptions with assumptions borrowed from other writing systems, expecting to find the kinds of historical records and royal propaganda that characterized Maya or Egyptian texts. When the Zapotec inscriptions failed to conform to these expectations, scholars concluded that the script might be nothing more than elaborate decoration or religious symbolism rather than true writing. This dismissive attitude had effectively stalled progress in Zapotec epigraphy for decades. Urcid's revolutionary insight was to recognize that the Zapotec writing system operated according to its own logic and conventions, which needed to be understood on their own terms rather than through comparisons with other ancient scripts. Working at Brandeis University in the 1990s, he began developing new analytical techniques that treated each inscription as part of a coherent communication system designed to convey specific information to ancient readers who shared cultural knowledge that modern scholars lacked. The breakthrough came from Urcid's systematic analysis of the calendrical elements embedded within Zapotec inscriptions. Unlike previous researchers who had focused primarily on identifying individual glyphs, Urcid examined the structural relationships between different symbols and their positions within complete texts. He discovered that Zapotec scribes had used a sophisticated combination of day names, numerical coefficients, and associated glyphs to create what were essentially historical records tied to the Mesoamerican calendar system. This calendrical foundation provided Urcid with the key he needed to unlock the broader meanings of Zapotec texts. By establishing the chronological framework within which the inscriptions operated, he could begin to identify patterns that revealed how the script encoded information about political events, ritual activities, and social relationships. The realization that these were genuine historical documents, rather than mere religious or decorative symbols, transformed the entire field of Zapotec studies. The implications of Urcid's decipherment work extended far beyond the specific content of individual inscriptions. His analysis revealed that the Zapotecs had developed a fully functional writing system by at least 500 BCE, making it potentially the earliest true script in the Americas. This discovery forced scholars to completely revise their understanding of literacy's development in the New World, pushing back the date of American writing by several centuries and challenging assumptions about the intellectual capabilities of early Mesoamerican societies. Perhaps even more significantly, Urcid's work demonstrated that Zapotec writing was not derivative of other Mesoamerican scripts, but represented an independent invention of literacy. While scholars had long debated whether writing had been invented once in Mesoamerica and then spread to other cultures, or whether different groups had developed writing independently, the Zapotec evidence suggested that the process of developing literacy had been more complex and varied than previously imagined. The methodological innovations that Urcid developed for analysing Zapotec inscriptions revolutionised the field of Mesoamerican epigraphy. His systematic approach to identifying scribal conventions, analysing textual structure, and correlating inscriptional evidence with archaeological context established new standards for decipherment work throughout the region. These techniques proved applicable not only to Zapotec texts, but to other poorly understood writing systems, including the Isthmian script and various undeciphered Maya inscriptions. Urcid's work also transformed understanding of Zapotec political organisation and social structure. The historical records preserved in the Monte Alban inscriptions revealed a complex state system with multiple rulers, elaborate ceremonial cycles, and extensive networks of political alliances and conflicts. Rather than the relatively simple chiefdom that some scholars had envisioned, Zapotec society emerged from Urcid's analysis as a sophisticated civilization capable of managing complex political and economic relationships across a wide geographical area. The decipherment of Zapotec writing provided crucial insights into the relationship between literacy and state formation in ancient Mesoamerica. Urcid's analysis demonstrated that writing had not simply emerged as a tool for record-keeping or religious expression, but had been intimately connected to the development of political authority and social complexity. The Zapotec script served multiple functions, documenting important political events, legitimizing royal authority, and creating permanent records of ritual activities that were central to maintaining social order. This understanding of writing's role in Zapotec society contributed to broader theoretical discussions about the relationship between literacy and civilization. Urcid's work showed that writing systems could develop along different trajectories depending on the specific cultural contexts in which they emerged. The Zapotec script was neither a pale imitation of other Mesoamerican writing systems, nor a failed attempt to achieve full literacy, but rather a successful adaptation of writing technology to meet the particular needs of Zapotec political and religious institutions. The technological aspects of Urcid's decipherment work reflected broader changes in archaeological methodology during the 1990s and 2000s. His systematic database of Zapotec inscriptions, which catalogued thousands of individual glyphs and their contextual relationships, represented one of the first comprehensive digital archives of Mesoamerican textual evidence. This computational approach to epigraphy allowed for types of analysis that would have been impossible using traditional methods, including statistical studies of glyph frequency, distributional analyses of scribal practices, and complex cross-referencing of inscriptional and archaeological evidence. The impact of Urcid's work on museum collections and cultural heritage preservation was equally significant. His decipherment of Zapotec texts revealed that many stone monuments in museums and private collections contained specific historical information that had never been recognized. Sculptures that had been displayed as examples of ancient artistry were revealed to be detailed historical documents, recording the names of rulers, dates of important events, and descriptions of political relationships that provided unprecedented insights into Zapotec history. This transformation in understanding also raised important questions about cultural ownership and the interpretation of indigenous American texts. Urcid's work demonstrated that Native American civilizations had possessed sophisticated literary traditions that were in no way inferior to those of Old World cultures. The complexity and antiquity of Zapotec writing challenged colonialist assumptions about indigenous intellectual capabilities and provided evidence for the independent development of complex cultural institutions in the Americas. The broader impact of Zapotec decipherment on Mesoamerican studies was felt across multiple disciplines. Art historians gained new tools for understanding the iconographic traditions of ancient Oaxaca, while archaeologists could for the first time correlate material culture with specific historical events and individual actors. Linguists working on Zapotec language reconstruction found invaluable evidence for the historical development of this important language family, while ethnohistorians discovered new sources for understanding the long-term development of indigenous political institutions. Urcid's success in deciphering Zapotec hieroglyphs also influenced approaches to other undeciphered scripts around the world. His methodological emphasis on understanding writing systems within their own cultural contexts, rather than imposing external interpretive frameworks, provided a model for epigraphy work on scripts as diverse as the Indus Valley signs, Linear A, and various Central Asian writing systems. The systematic, database-driven approach he pioneered became a standard tool in modern decipherment efforts. The transformation that Zapotec decipherment brought to understanding of American cultural history was perhaps most evident in educational contexts. Textbooks and museum displays that had previously portrayed pre-Columbian America as primarily oral cultures were forced to acknowledge the sophisticated literary traditions that had existed throughout much of Mesoamerica. Zahi Hawass and Valley of Golden Mummies /KV63, 1990s to 2000s. Every year millions of tourists flock to Egypt's museums and archaeological sites, cameras flashing as they marvel at golden treasures and ancient monuments that have become symbols of human civilization itself. The carefully managed experience they encounter, complete with professional guides, protected artifacts, and multimedia presentations that bring ancient Egypt to life, exists largely because of one man's controversial vision of how archaeology should engage with the modern world. Today's Egypt tourism industry, worth billions of dollars annually and supporting hundreds of thousands of jobs, was fundamentally transformed by discoveries and methods pioneered in the 1990s and 2000s. Yet the architect of this transformation, Zahi Hawass, remains one of the most polarizing figures in modern archaeology, simultaneously celebrated as Egypt's greatest archaeological showman and criticized as a publicity-seeking politician who compromised scientific integrity for popular appeal. The Egypt that tourists experience today bears little resemblance to the relatively obscure archaeological landscape that existed before Hawass revolutionized the field's relationship with media and public engagement. The mummies, treasures, and monuments that now attract global attention were once the exclusive province of specialized scholars working in academic isolation. The discovery that would change everything came in 1996 when Hawass and his team uncovered what would become known as the Valley of Golden Mummies in the Baharia Oasis, a remote desert region 370 kilometers southwest of Cairo. This extraordinary archaeological site contained nearly 250 mummies dating to the Greco-Roman period, many adorned with elaborate golden masks and decorations that represented the highest levels of ancient mortuary art. But the true significance of the Valley of Golden Mummies lay not in the artifacts themselves, remarkable though they were, but in how Hawass chose to present the discovery to the world. Unlike previous generations of archaeologists who published their findings in specialized journals, read only by academic colleagues, Hawass immediately recognized the site's potential for engaging global audiences. He orchestrated a media campaign that included television documentaries, newspaper interviews and public exhibitions that transformed the Bahariya discovery into an international sensation. Within months of the announcement, the Valley of Golden Mummies had become a household name, inspiring books, documentaries and tourist expeditions that brought unprecedented attention to Egyptian archaeology. This revolution in archaeological communication represented a fundamental break with traditional academic practices. The path that led Hawass to this moment had begun decades earlier in the small village of Al-Ubaidiya in the Nile Delta, where he was born in 1947 into a middle-class family with no particular connection to archaeology or academia. His early life was marked by the kind of modest circumstances typical of rural Egypt, and nothing in his background suggested he would become one of the world's most recognizable archaeologists. The young Hawass showed little initial interest in ancient history, focusing instead on more practical subjects that might provide economic security for his family. The transformation began during his undergraduate studies at Alexandria University, where Hawass enrolled in a Greco-Roman archaeology program almost by accident. The field attracted him initially not for its scholarly potential, but because it seemed to offer steady employment opportunities with the Egyptian government's Antiquities Service. However, his first exposure to actual archaeological fieldwork revealed an unexpected passion for uncovering and interpreting Egypt's ancient past. The physical process of excavation, the intellectual challenge of understanding ancient cultures, and the excitement of discovery combined to create a commitment that would define his entire career. The real turning point came when Hawass received a scholarship to pursue graduate studies at the University of Pennsylvania in the 1970s. This experience exposed him to American approaches to archaeology and museum management that emphasized public education and community outreach in ways that were largely unknown in Egypt at the time. American museums had already begun experimenting with interactive exhibits, multimedia presentations, and educational programs designed to make archaeology accessible to general audiences. Hawass absorbed these lessons and began envisioning how similar approaches might transform Egyptian archaeology. Returning to Egypt with his PhD in 1987, Hawass found an archaeological establishment that was largely isolated from public engagement and international attention. The country's ancient sites were managed by a small bureaucracy that focused primarily on conservation and academic research, while tourism remained a relatively minor consideration in archaeological planning. Most importantly, Egyptian archaeology was dominated by foreign expeditions that published their discoveries in international journals, while Egyptian scholars remained largely invisible in global archaeological discourse. Hawass recognized that this situation not only limited Egypt's control over its own heritage, but also represented a massive missed opportunity for economic and cultural development. The breakthrough discovery that would establish Hawass's international reputation came through his systematic approach to exploring Egypt's lesser-known archaeological sites. While most international attention focused on the famous monuments of Giza and Luxor, Hawass understood that Egypt's vast desert regions contain thousands of unexplored sites that might yield discoveries of equal significance. The Bahariya Oasis project began as part of this broader strategy to document and investigate neglected areas of the country's archaeological landscape. When local residents reported finding ancient remains in the desert near Bahariya town in 1996, Hawass immediately recognized the potential significance of the discovery. Preliminary excavations revealed not just individual mummies, but evidence of an enormous cemetery that had served the oasis community for several centuries during the Greco-Roman period. The preservation conditions were extraordinary, with the dry desert environment maintaining organic materials, textiles, and decorative elements that had completely disappeared from sites in the Nile Valley. Most remarkably, many of the mummies were decorated with elaborate golden masks and chest plates that represented artistic traditions previously unknown from this period and region. The decision to publicize the Valley of Golden Mummies discovery through popular media rather than academic channels represented a calculated gamble that would transform Hawass's career and Egyptian archaeology as a whole. Traditional archaeological protocol would have required years of detailed analysis before any public announcement, followed by publication in specialized journals that might eventually attract broader attention. Hawass instead chose to announce the discovery through press conferences and television interviews that immediately captured international attention and generated enormous public interest in Egyptian archaeology. The media strategy proved spectacularly successful, but also generated fierce criticism from academic colleagues who questioned whether showmanship was compatible with serious scholarship. Hawass's charismatic television appearances, complete with dramatic revelations and carefully staged unveilings of artifacts, made him one of the most recognizable archaeologists in the world, but also created suspicions about his scientific credibility. Critics argued that his emphasis on publicity and entertainment value compromised the methodical analysis that was essential to archaeological research, while supporters countered that his public engagement was bringing unprecedented resources and attention to Egyptian heritage preservation. The success of the Golden Mummy's publicity campaign led to additional high-profile discoveries that cemented Hawass's reputation as archaeology's premier showman. In 2005, his team discovered KV-63, a previously unknown tomb in the Valley of the Kings that contained mummification materials and artifacts from the 18th dynasty. Although the tomb did not contain a royal burial as initially hoped, Hawass orchestrated the discovery's revelation through live television broadcasts that attracted global audiences and generated enormous publicity for Egyptian tourism. These discoveries coincided with Hawass's rise through the ranks of Egypt's antiquities bureaucracy, ultimately leading to his appointment as Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities in 2002 and later as Egypt's first Minister of Antiquities in 2011. This combination of archaeological celebrity and administrative authority gave him unprecedented control over Egypt's heritage sites and the power to implement his vision of archaeology as both scientific discipline and popular entertainment. Under his leadership, Egyptian sites were transformed through improved visitor facilities, multimedia presentations, and educational programs that made ancient history accessible to millions of tourists while generating revenue that supported continued archaeological research. The revolution in public archaeology that Hawass pioneered had profound implications for the discipline as a whole. His success demonstrated that archaeological discoveries could capture popular imagination and generate significant economic benefits when presented through appropriate media channels. Museums worldwide began adopting similar approaches to exhibit design and public programming, while other archaeologists recognized that effective communication with general audiences was essential for securing research funding and political support. The transformation of archaeology from an academic specialty into a form of popular entertainment had both positive and negative consequences, expanding public interest in the past while also creating pressure to emphasize spectacular discoveries over methodical research. Political dimensions of Hawass's career became increasingly prominent as his international fame grew throughout the 2000s. His close association with the Mubarak government and his role in promoting Egypt's cultural heritage as a source of national pride made him a significant political figure in ways that previous archaeologists had never experienced. The 2011 Egyptian revolution that toppled Mubarak also ended Hawass's official career, as the new government sought to distance itself from figures associated with the previous regime. His dismissal from government service in July 2011 marked the end of an era in Egyptian archaeology and highlighted the complex relationships between archaeological research, political authority, and popular media. Gertrude Bell and Mesopotamian Surveys 1900s to 1920s. The sun beats down mercilessly on the Mesopotamian plain as a lone figure on horseback approaches the ancient mound. The year is 1909, and Gertrude Bell, already 41 and seasoned by countless desert journeys, surveys the ruins of Babylon with the practiced eye of both scholar and adventurer. She doesn't know it yet, but this moment represents more than just another archaeological expedition. She's standing at the crossroads of empires, cultures, and competing visions of the past. Bell's path to this dusty crossroads began far from the Middle East, in the drawing rooms of Victorian England. Born into privilege in 1868, she was expected to marry well and live quietly. Instead, she became something entirely different. The first woman to graduate with a first-class honours degree in modern history from Oxford. But even that achievement felt constraining. The real world beckoned beyond lecture halls and tea parties. Her first taste of the East came in 1892 during a visit to Tehran. The experience ignited something within her that polite English society could never satisfy. The languages, the customs, the ancient stones speaking of forgotten civilizations. All of it called to her with an intensity that would reshape her entire existence. By 1899, she was learning Arabic and embarking on her first serious archaeological expedition to Syria. What Bell encountered in those early travels would define the central tension of her career. The local people she met weren't simply exotic subjects to be studied or obstacles to be overcome. They were the living inheritors of the very civilizations she sought to understand. Syrian villagers showed her ruins their grandfathers had known. Bedouin guides led her to sites that existed in oral tradition long before any Western map recorded them. Turkish officials controlled access to archaeological treasures that European museums desperately wanted. This wasn't the clean, academic archaeology she might have imagined from her Oxford studies. This was archaeology embedded in politics, religion, and cultural identity. Every stone she documented, every photograph she took, every artifact she catalogued existed within a web of competing claims and conflicting interests. Bell's approach differed markedly from many of her contemporary archaeologists. Where others saw local knowledge as quaint folklore or inconvenient superstition, she recognized its value. She spent months learning local dialects, not just to communicate practically, but to understand how people conceptualized their own history. Her detailed letters home describe long conversations with village elders about the old stories associated with various ruins. Yet she remained unmistakably a product of her time and class. Her archaeological work served multiple masters. The knowledge she gathered enhanced Western understanding of ancient Mesopotamian civilizations, but it also provided valuable intelligence for British imperial interests. Her famous 1905 expedition through Syria and Turkey produced both scholarly articles and detailed reports for the British government about regional politics and strategic routes. The complexity of her position became most apparent during her documentation work in northern Syria between 1905 and 1914. She systematically photographed and described hundreds of archaeological sites, creating what remains one of the most comprehensive early surveys of the region. But this work took place against a backdrop of Ottoman decline and growing European interference. Local communities increasingly viewed foreign archaeologists with suspicion, seeing them as advanced scouts for colonial expansion. Bell found herself navigating these suspicions daily. Her success depended on building relationships with local leaders. From village headmen to regional governors, she learned to present her work in terms that resonated with local values. When documenting early Christian sites in Syria, she emphasized their connection to local religious traditions rather than their significance to European scholarship. When working near Islamic monuments, she demonstrated respectful knowledge of their religious importance. This cultural navigation required genuine transformation on Bell's part. The confident young Oxford graduate gradually evolved into something more complex. Part scholar, part diplomat, part cultural interpreter. She began to see archaeological sites not as isolated objects of study, but as living parts of ongoing cultural landscapes. The ruins weren't simply ancient. They were embedded in the daily lives, religious practices, and historical consciousness of contemporary communities. The most profound collision came after 1915, when Bell joined the British administration in Mesopotamia during World War I. Suddenly, her archaeological expertise became a tool of governance. The new British authorities needed to understand the region they sought to control, and Bell's deep knowledge of local sites, tribal relationships, and cultural practices made her invaluable. But governing meant making choices that purely academic work could avoid. When Bell helped establish Iraq's first antiquities law in the early 1920s, she faced intense opposition from Sati al-Husri, the Iraqi Director General of Education, and a passionate Arab nationalist. Al-Husri saw Bell's proposed law as another form of colonial extraction, allowing Western institutions to claim the best artifacts while leaving Iraq with inferior remains. The conflict wasn't simply about objects, it was about identity and sovereignty. Al-Husri argued that Iraq's archaeological heritage belonged first and foremost to Iraqi people, not to Western museums or scholars. He wanted antiquities laws that prioritized local institutions and Iraqi expertise over foreign archaeological missions. Bell, despite her genuine affection for the region and its people, remained committed to international archaeological collaboration that inevitably privileged Western institutions. Their confrontation played out over months of negotiations. Al-Husri delayed passage of Bell's proposed law, demanding revisions that would give Iraq greater control over its archaeological heritage. Bell found herself caught between her archaeological colleagues, who wanted maximum access to sites and artifacts, and Iraqi officials, who increasingly insisted on genuine partnership rather than polite collaboration. The final law, passed in 1924, reflected this tension. It established the principle that half of all finds would remain in Iraq, with the other half going to foreign excavators. This compromise satisfied no one completely. Western archaeologists complained about restricted access to materials. Iraqi officials felt they were still being shortchanged. But the law represented something new, the first recognition that local communities and national governments had legitimate claims to archaeological heritage that couldn't simply be overruled by scholarly interest. Bell's role in creating this framework marked her final transformation. She began her career as an adventurous individual pursuing personal scholarly interests. The desert changed her into something more complex, an archaeological diplomat who understood that studying the past meant engaging with contemporary politics, cultural identity, and competing visions of ownership. Her establishment of Iraq's first national museum represented the culmination of this evolution. Rather than simply facilitating the export of artifacts to European collections, she worked to create institutions within Iraq that could preserve and interpret the region's archaeological heritage for local audiences. She trained Iraqi staff, developed local conservation techniques, and created exhibitions that connected ancient Mesopotamian civilizations to modern Iraqi identity. The museum became a symbol of the cultural collision that had shaped Bell's entire career. It housed artifacts that might otherwise have ended up in London or Paris, but it did so using Western museum techniques and interpretive frameworks. It celebrated Iraq's ancient heritage, but through methods developed by foreign scholars. It represented both cultural preservation and cultural transformation. Bell's work in these final years reveals how profoundly the experience of cultural collision had changed her understanding of archaeology itself. She no longer saw herself as simply extracting knowledge from the past for the benefit of Western scholarship. Instead, she recognized archaeology as a collaborative enterprise that required negotiation between different cultural perspectives, political interests, and visions of historical significance. This recognition came at personal cost. Her colleagues in Britain sometimes viewed her advocacy for Iraqi archaeological interests as betraying Western scholarship. Iraqi officials occasionally saw her continued connections to British institutions as evidence of divided loyalties. She found herself increasingly isolated, belonging fully neither to the Western academic world that had shaped her training, nor to the Middle Eastern cultural context that had transformed her perspective. The tensions Bell navigated continue to define archaeology today. Questions about cultural heritage ownership, the relationship between local knowledge and academic expertise, and the responsibilities of foreign researchers working in post-colonial contexts all trace back to the conflicts she experienced firsthand. Her career illustrates how archaeological work inevitably becomes entangled with broader questions of power, identity, and cultural representation. When Bell died in Baghdad in 1926, just 2 years after the Antiquities Law took effect, she left behind more than scholarly publications and museum collections. She had created new ways of thinking about the relationship between archaeological research and cultural respect, between Western scholarship and local knowledge, between studying the past and serving contemporary communities. Tatiana Proskouriakoff and Maya Historical Inscriptions, 1960. In a windowless basement office at Harvard's Peabody Museum, surrounded by towering stacks of architectural drawings and stone rubbings, a Russian-American woman sits hunched over a desk covered with photographs of Maya stelae. The year is 1958, and Tatiana Proskouriakoff has been staring at these same carved stones for months, searching for patterns that no one else has seen. She doesn't realize she's about to shatter one of archaeology's most entrenched beliefs and give voice to a civilization that scholars thought had remained forever silent about its own history. Proskouriakoff's journey to this moment began far from the jungles of Guatemala. Born in Siberia in 1909, she arrived in America as a child when her family fled the Russian Revolution. Her path to Maya archaeology was anything but direct. She started as an architecture student at Penn State, drawn to the precise lines of technical drawing and the challenge of reconstructing ancient buildings from scattered stones. When she graduated in 1930, jobs were scarce, and the young woman with the foreign name found herself working for a few dollars a week, drafting architectural reconstructions for the University of Pennsylvania Museum. That work caught the attention of Linton Satterthwaite, who was planning an expedition to the Maya site of Piedras Negras in Guatemala. He needed someone who could accurately record the complex architectural details of Maya buildings. Proskouriakoff's technical skills made her the perfect candidate, even though she'd never set foot in a jungle or studied a single Maya glyph. In 1936, she joined her first archaeological expedition, thinking she was simply documenting buildings. She had no idea she was entering a field on the verge of revolution. The Maya world that Proskouriakoff encountered was dominated by an elegant theory that had shaped decades of scholarship. The leading authority was Sir Eric Thompson, a British archaeologist whose interpretation of Maya civilization had become archaeological orthodoxy. According to Thompson's view, the Maya were a peaceful theocracy ruled by priest astronomers. Their elaborate stone monuments recorded nothing but calendrical calculations, astronomical observations, and religious ceremonies. The intricate glyphs carved on their stelae were thought to be purely calendrical and ceremonial, containing no historical information about actual people or political events. This interpretation fit perfectly with early 20th century romantic notions about ancient civilizations. The Maya became the philosopher kings of the New World, so devoted to abstract intellectual pursuits that they had transcended the mundane concerns of politics, warfare, and personal ambition that characterized other ancient societies. Thompson's view dominated Maya studies so completely that questioning it seemed almost heretical. Proskouriakoff spent her early years in Maya archaeology accepting this framework completely. Her job was to draw and measure buildings, not to interpret inscriptions. She created stunning architectural reconstructions that helped establish how Maya cities might have appeared in their heyday. Her artistic training allowed her to visualize ancient structures with unprecedented accuracy. But gradually, as she spent more time at Maya sites, she began to notice things that didn't quite fit the prevailing theories. The breakthrough began with what seemed like simple organizational work. By the 1950s, Proskouriakoff had accumulated hundreds of photographs and drawings of Maya stelae from sites across the Maya region. She decided to organize this material systematically, grouping monuments by site and arranging them chronologically. What emerged from this methodical cataloguing was a pattern that no one had noticed before. At Piedras Negras, she found that the stelae seemed to fall into distinct groups, each spanning roughly 60 to 70 years. Within each group, the earliest monuments showed figures in simple dress, while later ones depicted increasingly elaborate costumes and regalia. The pattern was so regular it seemed unlikely to be coincidental. If these monuments really recorded only astronomical and religious information, why would they show such consistent chronological patterns? Proskouriakoff began to suspect that these monuments might actually commemorate the reigns of individual rulers. The 60 to 70-year spans matched what might be expected for human lifetimes. The increasingly elaborate regalia might reflect a ruler's growing power and status over time. But if this was true, it meant the Maya inscriptions contained historical information, not just calendrical calculations. The crucial test came when Proskouriakoff began examining specific glyphs that appeared consistently in the inscriptions. She identified two particular glyph compounds that seemed to mark important moments in each chronological sequence. One appeared early in each ruler's apparent reign, the other near the end. She began to suspect these might record birth and death dates, or perhaps accession to power and death. Working with Maya calendrical specialists, Proskouriakoff calculated the actual dates represented by these glyphs. The results were startling. The time spans between the two key events consistently fell within human lifetimes. Moreover, when she examined monuments from the same site, she found that the end of one chronological sequence corresponded closely with the beginning of the next, suggesting dynastic succession. By 1960, Proskouriakoff was ready to present her revolutionary findings. Her paper, Historical Implications of a Pattern of Dates at Piedras Negras, Guatemala, appeared in American Antiquity and immediately sent shockwaves through Maya studies. She proposed that Maya stelae recorded the births, accessions, and deaths of actual historical rulers. The elaborate figures carved on the monuments weren't generic priests or gods, but portraits of specific kings who had ruled Maya cities over 1,000 years ago. The implications of this discovery extended far beyond simple identification of rulers. If Maya inscriptions recorded history, then the entire civilization needed to be reinterpreted. Instead of peaceful theocracies, Maya cities emerged as dynamic political entities ruled by competing dynasties. The inscriptions began to reveal a complex world of warfare, alliance, political marriage, and dynastic struggle that had been completely invisible under the old interpretation. Proskouriakoff's breakthrough also revolutionized the methodology of Maya epigraphy. She demonstrated that systematic analysis of patterns across multiple sites could reveal meanings that studying individual inscriptions could never uncover. Her approach combined artistic sensitivity to visual patterns with rigorous statistical analysis of chronological data. This interdisciplinary methodology became the foundation for all subsequent advances in Maya decipherment. The reaction to her discoveries revealed the conservative nature of established archaeological authority. Eric Thompson, whose theories were being directly challenged, initially resisted Proskouriakoff's interpretation. The debate that followed wasn't simply about methodology or evidence, but about fundamental assumptions regarding the nature of Maya civilization. Thompson's romantic vision of peaceful priest astronomers clashed with Proskouriakoff's evidence for historical rulers and political conflict. However, the strength of Proskouriakoff's evidence gradually won over the scholarly community. Her identification of birth and accession glyphs could be tested at other sites, and the results consistently supported her interpretation. More importantly, her historical approach opened up entirely new avenues for research. Other scholars began applying her methods to sites across the Maya region, revealing dynastic histories that spanned centuries. The transformation of Maya studies accelerated rapidly after 1960. Scholars began identifying specific historical events recorded in the inscriptions, including wars, royal marriages, and territorial conquests. The abstract calendrical calculations that had dominated previous scholarship were reinterpreted as records of historical events tied to specific dates. Maya civilization emerged from the realm of romantic mystery into the clear light of documented history. Proskouriakoff's work also challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between art and writing in ancient civilizations. She showed that the elaborate figural scenes on Maya monuments weren't decorative additions to calendrical texts, but integral parts of historical narratives. The portraits of rulers, the depictions of ceremonies, and the complex iconographic programs all worked together to commemorate specific historical moments. This insight transformed how archaeologists approached visual culture in all ancient civilizations. The idea that artistic representation could carry historical information just as effectively as written text became a cornerstone of modern archaeological interpretation. Proskouriakoff's work demonstrated that understanding ancient art required the same rigorous analytical methods used to decipher ancient writing. The broader implications of her discoveries extended beyond Maya studies to fundamental questions about the nature of ancient American civilizations. The revelation that Maya inscriptions recorded history challenged long-standing assumptions about New World cultural development. If the Maya had been documenting their political history for over 1,000 years, their civilization was far more sophisticated than most scholars had previously recognized. Proskouriakoff's breakthrough also highlighted the importance of interdisciplinary collaboration in archaeological research. Her background in architecture gave her the visual training necessary to recognize patterns in monument groups. Her artistic skills allowed her to see relationships between visual and textual elements that purely textual scholars had missed. Her statistical approach brought analytical rigor to what had previously been largely intuitive interpretation. The methodological revolution she initiated continued throughout her career. After identifying birth and accession glyphs, she turned her attention to the historical events recorded between these dates. She began to identify glyphs for warfare, capture, and other political activities. Each new identification opened up more of the Maya historical record, revealing an increasingly complex picture of classic period politics. Her work at sites like Yaxchilan revealed detailed records of royal women, dynastic marriages, and the role of queens in Maya politics. These discoveries challenged another archaeological assumption, that ancient American societies were uniformly male-dominated. The Maya inscriptions showed queens ruling in their own right, conducting warfare, and participating actively in political alliances. Proskouriakoff's later career focused on training a new generation of Maya epigraphers who could build on her discoveries. She mentored students at Harvard who would go on to make their own breakthrough discoveries in Maya decipherment. Her systematic approach to pattern recognition became the standard methodology for approaching undeciphered inscriptions in any ancient writing system. The field that emerged from her revolutionary work bore little resemblance to the Maya studies that had existed before 1960. Where Thompson's generation had seen timeless religious mysteries, Proskouriakoff's successors found detailed political histories. Where earlier scholars had found abstract astronomical calculations, later researchers discovered records of specific battles, royal ceremonies, and dynastic successions. Her transformation from architectural draftsperson to revolutionary epigrapher illustrates how scientific breakthroughs often come from unexpected directions. She approached Maya inscriptions without the theoretical baggage that had limited previous scholars. Her artistic training allowed her to see patterns that text-focused researchers had overlooked. Her systematic methodology brought analytical rigor to what had been largely intuitive scholarship. The revolution Proskouriakoff initiated in Maya studies continues today. Modern epigraphers use increasingly sophisticated methods to extract historical information from Maya inscriptions, but they build on the foundation she established in 1960. Every major discovery in Maya decipherment traces back to her fundamental insight that these inscriptions recorded the lives and deeds of actual historical people.